My name is Teresa Callahan, and for 15 years I have worked the night floor of an intensive care unit in Richmond, Virginia, charting other people's vitals while nobody, not once, checked mine. I used to believe that the people who were supposed to protect you did it automatically, the way a heart just keeps beating without being asked. I was wrong 3 times, in 3 different ways, before I finally learned how to check my own pulse. The first time, it was blood, a room above a law office, a folder nobody had asked to see, and a will that gave everything to a cousin who had never paid a single bill in his life. I found out what 6 years of quiet devotion was worth. It was worth nothing, typed in careful lawyer's language, with the words, with love added at the bottom like a bandage on a wound that was never going to close that way. The second time, it was love, or the version of it I let myself believe in. A man who learned exactly how tired I was before he ever asked me to sign anything. By the time I understood what he had done to the house I'd bought with my own 2 hands, the damage already had a number attached to it, and the number had 6 digits. The third time was the one I never saw coming, because it came from the person who had spent 15 years teaching me how to survive this profession. She was supposed to be the last safe name on my list. She turned out to be the most expensive lesson of all 3. This is not a story about one betrayal. It's a story about 3 of them, stacked one on top of the other, each one heavier than the last. Each one from somebody who had a duty to catch me and chose, instead, to spend me. I kept records of all 3. Charts, statements, emails, dates. It's the one skill nobody could ever take from me. And in the end, it was the only skill that mattered. It started on an ordinary Tuesday in February, with a text message from my mother that looked, at the time, like nothing at all. "We're getting things in order, sweetheart. We need you here Thursday." I read it standing in a hospital hallway with somebody else's chart still open in my hands, and I felt something warm and foolish bloom in my chest. Needed. I had no idea yet what that word was about to cost me. Getting a half-day off during flu season on a night ICU rotation counts as a small miracle, and my charge nurse cashed in a favor for me without asking why I needed it. I drove out to Ashbury Falls, the town outside Richmond where my parents had spent 40 years, carrying a folder of paperwork I'd assembled that morning at my own kitchen table, my father's prescriptions, a printout of the mortgage balance, insurance numbers, everything sorted by color because that is simply how my brain organizes a crisis before it's officially become one. I remember thinking, driving those 40 minutes with the radio off, that they had finally asked their daughter to bring the spreadsheets into the room instead of just handing her the bill afterward. It is a strange thing. Being useful for so long that you mistake it for being wanted. I had built my whole adult identity around being the one who read the fine print, who sat on hold with insurance companies so my mother wouldn't have to, who kept a running list in her phone of every date 2 aging people could no longer be trusted to remember on their own. The lawyer's suite occupied the 2nd floor of a squat brick building past the hardware store, tucked above an old dry cleaner whose chemical smell still clung faintly to the stairwell no matter how many times somebody had tried to mask it with air freshener. I climbed those stairs, rehearsing the calm, useful version of myself I intended to bring through the door, the way I rehearse a hard conversation with a patient's family before I ever knock. Then I pushed the conference room door open, and everything I'd rehearsed evaporated at once. My Aunt Sharon was already seated, gripping her purse in her lap like she expected someone to take it from her. Beside her sat my cousin Derek, 33, in a suit jacket clearly bought for interviews rather than family gatherings. Coffee had been poured for both of them and set out neatly. There was none for me. My parents sat across the table, and my father had turned almost entirely away, his attention fixed on something out in the parking lot that apparently required his full concentration. I stood there holding paperwork nobody had requested. The lawyer, a soft-spoken, gray-templed man named Gordon Ellery, glanced up and said my name gently, the way you'd address someone about to receive test results. He told me he appreciated me making the drive, and that what came next would be difficult to sit through. He opened a binder and began reading in the same measured voice I imagine he uses for closings and probate hearings, a voice built for delivering unwelcome facts without appearing to enjoy it. My parents, he explained, had established a revocable trust. Into it had gone the house on Larkspur Lane, their savings, my father's truck. Upon both of their deaths, everything in that trust would pass, in full, to Derek Voss. Then he lowered the binder slightly and read the final clause more slowly, as though giving me time to brace. Regarding their daughter, Teresa Callahan, no provision had been made, and the omission, the document specified, was intentional. 2 words followed it. With love. Someone had chosen those words deliberately. Someone had decided cruelty needed softening before it could be spoken aloud in a room with an audience. Mr. Ellery went on to explain, almost apologetically, why he'd insisted I be present for the reading rather than simply mailing me a summary later. In his experience, when parents exclude a child from an estate, telling them directly, in person, prevents worse surprises down the road. It heads off legal challenges. It is, in his professional opinion, the kinder path through an unkind decision. I nodded along, aware that my body was still performing politeness while the rest of me had already gone somewhere else entirely, out past whatever my father found so fascinating in that parking lot. My mother reached over and folded my hand between both of hers. Her hands have always run warm. "Nothing about us changes, sweetheart," she said, squeezing gently, as if the gesture itself could undo what had just been read into the record. "You'll still be there for us. That's simply who you are." I looked at my father. He still hadn't managed to meet my eyes since I'd arrived. 68 years old, 4 decades spent loading freight off container ships at the port, and he was studying that empty parking lot as if a final exam depended on it. Across the table. My aunt smoothed an invisible wrinkle from her skirt and delivered a line I could tell she'd practiced somewhere between her house and this office. "Everyone agreed on this together," she said. "It's simply the fairest outcome." Derek, for his part, leaned back in his borrowed-looking jacket and offered, "You're still invited for Thanksgiving, Teresa? Obviously." Obviously. I let my eyes move across each of them once, slowly, the way I scan a monitor for the one reading that doesn't fit the pattern, searching for whatever detail might make the whole picture add up honestly. My father never once turned from the window. I stood, thanked Mr. Ellery for his time, and told them I had a shift waiting for me, which happened to be completely true. Nobody raised their voice. I didn't cry. I gathered up paperwork nobody had wanted to look at, and something about my composure seemed to unsettle that room far more than tears would have. My aunt's mouth tightened into a thin line. My mother's smile flickered like a bulb about to fail. People who have already scripted the scene where you break down rarely know what to do when you decline to perform it. I was nearly to my car in the lot below when my father's voice reached me, rough and urgent, calling my name across the cold asphalt. And I turned to see exactly what that walk down the stairs had taken out of him. He must have taken those stairs at a pace no man with his lungs had any business attempting, because he arrived beside me, already gasping, both palms flat against my trunk while his chest fought to catch up, watching him struggle there in the cold parking lot. I understood something neither of us had put into words, yet whatever was happening inside him had progressed further than anyone had told me, maybe further than my parents were willing to admit, even privately to each other. "Your mother and Sharon," he managed, once he had enough air to spend on it. Once the two of them decide something together, arguing with it is like arguing with the weather. That was the whole of his defense. That single sentence was everything he had to offer for years of staying quiet while decisions got made around him and through him and, eventually, against me. I looked at this man who had spent 4 decades hauling freight for other people and realized he had never once, in all that time, tried to haul a hard conversation out of his own dinner table. I felt something close to anger and something close to tenderness occupying the exact same space in my chest, refusing to cancel each other out. Then he reached into his coat and pressed something small and cold into my palm. A key, worn smooth along one edge. The key to the steel chest out in his garage. The one where he'd spent 30 years rebuilding small engines and avoiding every holiday gathering he found too loud to sit through. "For whenever you need someplace quiet to think it over," he said. My father has never once said the word sorry to me in his entire life. Instead, he hands people keys, as if a lock somewhere might explain what his mouth never could. He looked like he wanted to say more, and then his gaze shifted past my shoulder, toward the office window above us, where a curtain had just twitched. He gave the trunk of my car 2 quick pats, the way you'd send off a horse you were leaving behind in its stall, and disappeared back inside. I sat behind the wheel for a long while before starting the engine. I slid the new key onto my ring, next to the brass house key I'd carried since I was 17, 2 pieces of metal that had somehow ended up holding my entire relationship with that family. My father's whole vocabulary for love had always run through objects rather than words. When I was 9 and shattered my wrist falling out of the maple tree in our backyard, he never once said he'd been scared. He simply spent a weekend building me a low wooden ramp for getting my bike up the porch steps one-handed, sanding every edge twice over until my palm could glide across it without catching. And even at 9, I understood that all that sanding was the apology he didn't have other words for. My phone lit up on the passenger seat with its ordinary chime. A notification from my bank. Upcoming automatic transfer. $1,320. 3 days from now. I looked at that little rectangle of light for a long time, the way you'd look at a monitor telling you something your body already understood before your mind agreed to catch up. I should be honest here, because it matters for everything that follows. I wasn't shocked by the trust itself. I wish I could say I was. But some part of me had suspected for years that my parents thought of me less as a daughter and more as infrastructure, the kind nobody thanks because it has simply never once given out. What actually knocked the wind out of me in that conference room wasn't the money or the house. It was those 2 words typed carefully at the bottom of the page, "with love." Somebody had taken the time to make an erasure sound tender, and I couldn't stop turning that particular cruelty over in my mind the whole drive home. I drove the 40 minutes back to Richmond in silence. No radio, no calls. I didn't cry. And in 15 years of watching families absorb terrible news in hospital corridors, I've noticed the ones who cry immediately are often the ones who recover fastest. It's the quiet ones you learn to watch closely. It's the quiet ones who go home afterward and start making lists, somewhere around the county line. I caught myself running the kind of silent assessment I usually reserve for patients who insist they're fine when they clearly aren't. Pulse steady. Almost too steady, the specific calm that sometimes arrives right before a crash. Breathing even, deliberately so. Affect flat, which in anyone else I'd have flagged immediately. I noted all of it and kept driving, because underneath that flat affect, some part of me had already begun drafting a plan, the way my hands sometimes start prepping equipment before my brain has consciously registered that a patient is coding. By the time I reached my own driveway, I didn't have a finished plan yet, but I had the first item on the list, and it was simple enough to fit on one line. Stop financing a family that had just told me in writing, witnessed and notarized, precisely what I was worth to them. I sat in my parked car outside my own building for another few minutes before going inside, turning the tool chest key over between my fingers, letting the ridges bite lightly into my skin so I'd have something physical to focus on besides the conference room replaying itself on a loop. I thought about how strange it was that the two most honest gestures I'd received all day had come wordlessly. A key pressed into my palm, and a notification demanding money I hadn't yet decided to keep sending. Somewhere between those two objects sat the entire shape of my family. One hand offering comfort and silence, the other reaching for my wallet without ever once needing to ask out loud. To make sense of how I ended up in that conference room, you need the spring Derek's detailing shop started going under 6 years before any of this. He'd opened the place with a small business loan and more optimism than planning. A strip mall storefront off Route 1 where he buffed scratches and vacuumed out minivans for people chasing the feeling that a clean car equals a managed life. It failed the way most undercapitalized businesses fail. A slow leak that nobody patches until the whole thing is underwater. When the leak turned serious, Derek didn't call me, even though I was the one relative who actually understood loan terms well enough to help him restructure something. He drove straight past me and went to my parents instead. What my parents did next, they did without telling me a single word of it beforehand. They took the house on Larkspur Lane, 30 years into its mortgage and nearly paid off, and refinanced it to pull $85,000 in cash, which they handed to Derek to keep his shop breathing a little longer. I only learned about it afterward, once every signature was already dry, and the timing happened to line up with my father's first real hospitalization, 3 days of supplemental oxygen while his lungs negotiated with him about whether they still wanted the job. Nobody in the family ever connected those two events out loud in my presence, but I have never once believed they were unrelated. The body keeps a ledger of its own, whatever else you call it. The new loan terms were brutal once I finally saw the paperwork months later. $135,000, spread across 15 years, landing somewhere near $1,300 a month once taxes and insurance were folded in. Between my father's pension and their joint Social Security, there was no realistic way to cover that number. Not with his prescriptions multiplying by the season. The bank gave them exactly 30 days to make the first payment work. My mother never once picked up a phone and asked me directly for money. What she did instead was quieter and considerably more effective. She sat at her kitchen table with the new repayment schedule spread out in front of her, crying in that specific, contained way she has perfected over 6 decades of getting precisely what she needs without raising her voice. And when I happened to stop by that particular Sunday, she simply looked up at me across the table. I was 30, freshly promoted to charge nurse, still riding the high of a milestone I'd wanted to celebrate with people who loved me for it. What came out of my mouth next shaped the following 6 years of my life without my ever deciding it should. I told her I could handle it for a little while, just until things stabilized on their end. The shop folded anyway. Within a few months, the way these arrangements usually resolve once the rescue money has already been spent down to nothing. And here's the detail that kept me up at night for years afterward. Nobody in that family ever said the actual number out loud again. $85,000. Gone into a business that lasted barely another season. Never once mentioned at a single holiday table for the rest of my life. A temporary arrangement stretched into 72 consecutive payments across 6 years. Every 28th of the month, $1,320 left my account automatically, because I understood my own psychology well enough to know that manual approval, month after month, would eventually give me an opening to hesitate, and hesitating was a door I refused to leave open for myself. Along the way, I absorbed other costs without ever formally deciding to. Their cell service merged into my plan. My mother's car insurance. Once the premium climbed past what she could manage alone, a roof replacement 2 springs back, when water started coming through into my father's workshop and the contractor simply started emailing invoices to my address. Since somewhere in those years I had quietly become the default billing contact for 2 grown adults' entire lives. I kept renting a modest 1-bedroom north of the city while people my age were closing on starter homes. I sent a gift instead of buying a plane ticket to a close friend's destination wedding, doing the math and choosing the mortgage payment instead. Twice. Only twice. I gathered the nerve to ask about being added to the deed, or, at minimum, putting some version of our arrangement in writing. Both times, my mother looked genuinely hurt by the suggestion, and my father found something urgent to do with his hands. And she told me the house would come to me eventually anyway. So why introduce something as cold as paperwork into something warm? By the time I ever saw an actual document, the refinance had already closed. The bank cared only that its payment arrived on schedule, and the 30-day window my parents had been given left no space to negotiate terms I never got shown in the first place. I paid up front, every month, and negotiated nothing. Ever. That promise that the house would eventually be mine was the exact thing that got torn apart, deliberately and in front of witnesses, in a conference room above a dry cleaner. I had carried that promise through all 72 payments without once questioning it. Looking back now, I can see the whole arrangement had a kind of architecture to it, even if nobody involved would have called it that at the time. My parents needed a solution, and I supplied one, quietly and reliably enough that the need for an actual conversation about ownership, about fairness, about what any of this was doing to my own future, never became urgent enough to force comfort. Once it's been secured, rarely goes looking for the person who's paying for it. I understand that now the way I understand a lab value that's been quietly trending in the wrong direction for months before anyone finally orders the test that explains it. That night, back in my own kitchen, I poured a glass of wine I never actually drank and opened my banking app on my phone, staring at the little icon for a long moment before I let myself tap it. My whole profession runs on a version of this same instinct. Every shift, I compare what was ordered against what was actually given, what a chart claims happened against what I watched happen with my own eyes standing at the bedside. I catch the places where 2 numbers ought to line up and don't, and I chase the discrepancy until I understand it. For 6 straight years, though, I had never once turned that same instinct on my own finances. Some quieter part of me, I suspect, understood exactly what I'd find if I looked too closely. So I scrolled, and the pattern was right there, waiting for me. An unbroken column of outgoing transfers stretching back further than the screen could show in one glance. Always the 28th, always $1,320, month after month. Surviving job changes and apartment moves and 2 separate winters where I drove on bald tires because the mortgage payment came first every single time. The house payment, her insurance, the phone bill, that roof, $3,100, 2 springs back, added up. And one side of my personal ledger showed something past $114,000 spent keeping 2 other people comfortable. On the opposite side sat a single fond nickname and an inheritance clause that a roomful of witnesses had just watched get struck out on purpose. Right in front of the one person it was allegedly meant to comfort. Doing this kind of long-haul math past midnight, I thought of a phrase we use constantly at work, when a treatment plan simply isn't producing results no matter how aggressively you pursue it. You reassess. You stop feeding resources into something that has already shown you, repeatedly and clearly, exactly what it is. My thumb hovered directly over the cancel button on that automatic transfer, and it would have felt satisfying to press it right there. Still 11 at night, wine untouched beside the laptop. I made myself wait instead. Years of watching families make catastrophic decisions in hospital hallways at 3 in the morning taught me one rule that has never once let me down. Never finalize anything permanent about someone you love while the wound they just gave you is still actively bleeding. I set the phone face down on the counter and forced myself to bed. Purely on discipline. The same discipline the job has drilled into me for letting adrenaline drain out of a decision before trusting it. By morning, the anger had burned itself out completely, the way anger tends to, loud and fast and gone. What replaced it was something colder, and honestly something my family should have been considerably more worried about. I had become thorough. I brewed coffee and pulled out the same yellow legal pad I use at the hospital when I'm mapping a discharge plan for someone whose situation has gotten complicated, weighing what a patient genuinely needs against what they can realistically sustain once they're back on their own. I built my own list exactly the same way, item by item, stripped of anything but the facts. I want to be honest about something here, because it says more about that entire year than almost anything else that happened in it. That list wasn't born out of spite. Spite is unreliable. It burns out somewhere around the 4th item on any list. A written plan just sits there patiently on the page, waiting for you to execute the next step, whether your feelings have caught up yet or not. By the time I shut the laptop that Saturday morning, 4 items sat written down in the exact order I planned to carry them out, and beneath the 4th one, in smaller handwriting, a note I would return to more than once over the following weeks. This isn't revenge. This is an accurate accounting of what I actually still owe. I read that line several times before finally getting up to shower and start the day, believing it completely. Standing under the water. I thought of another phrase we use on the unit. The moment a family finally agrees to stop chasing an outcome and simply focus on comfort instead. We call it a shift in the goals of care. Nobody involved is giving up on anything. The objective has simply changed, from fighting a battle that was never going to be won to protecting whatever dignity is still salvageable in the time remaining. Standing there that Saturday, I understood that my own goals of care needed the same kind of shift. It would take the rest of that year, and 2 more betrayals still waiting somewhere further down the road, before I fully understood that an accurate accounting and a quiet form of justice are not always the exact same thing, and that the truest ledger a person can keep is sometimes the one that finally, after years of only ever subtracting, starts crediting something back onto her own side of the page for a change. Getting dressed that morning, I caught my own reflection in the bathroom mirror and hardly recognized the calm on my face. Not happiness, exactly. Something steadier than that. Something closer to the particular stillness I feel walking into a code I already know how to run. I had spent 6 years being the person everyone else in that family could count on, without ever once asking whether the arrangement was sustainable for me. Whatever came next, I told my reflection, would at least be honest about its costs. Saturday morning arrived with coffee and the same yellow legal pad, and I worked through my list the way I'd map out a discharge plan for a patient whose case had grown complicated, weighing what someone genuinely needs against what they can actually sustain once they're on their own. Except the patient being discharged this time was me, first on the list, the mortgage transfer. I found the setting on my banking app and switched it off in under a minute, and after 6 years of my thumb pausing over that exact button every single month, the bank's system accepted the change without so much as a confirmation prompt, asking whether I was certain. Next, the shared phone plan. I let their 2 lines finish out the billing cycle I'd already covered, then scheduled the account to split off onto its own plan the following month. I have no interest in leaving a 65-year-old woman without a working phone in the middle of a billing period out of spite. I read the fine print on everything, including my own decisions, and the fine print here gave me a clean, well-documented exit that hurt no one unnecessarily. Third, my mother's car insurance, which I set to lapse at the natural end of its current term rather than renew, with the cancellation notice mailed directly to her by the insurer, not routed through me. I wanted the paper trail to make clear, in writing that wasn't mine, exactly whose decision this had been. Fourth, a small savings account I'd nicknamed years earlier, the one I kept stocked for exactly this kind of roof or furnace emergency, just over $6,000 sitting there for a crisis that would, from now on, no longer be mine to absorb. I renamed the account and folded the balance into my own retirement fund instead. It's strange how long a task can feel while you're dreading it and how quickly it actually goes once you finally start clicking through the steps. An hour and a half, beginning to end. 6 years of financial entanglement, quietly dismantled in less time than it takes to get through one moderately busy shift. I didn't send a group text explaining any of it. No dramatic announcement, no ultimatum. Nothing ending with some version of "I hope you'll understand someday." They had made their decision about me in a lawyer's office without inviting me into the conversation. I made mine at my own kitchen table, under the same terms. One thing matters here more than it might seem to. I never blocked a single phone number. Blocking is loud, a door slamming shut, and a slammed door is still, in its own strange way, a form of communication. Still a message being sent whether you intend one or not. What I wanted instead was quieter than that. I wanted the one thing this family had never once given me in 36 years. Silence that simply failed to show up on schedule. Then I put the legal pad away in a drawer and waited to see what the 28th of the following month would bring. For the next 30 days, it brought nothing at all. And that, I promise you, is the cruelest twist in this entire story. Not one relative reached out to ask how I'd been holding up since that meeting. Nobody wondered out loud whether that must have been hard to sit through. My mother managed exactly 2 messages that whole month. One was a photo of Derek's daughters in matching pajamas, forwarded with 0 commentary attached. The other asked whether I'd seen a cousin's birthday post online, punctuated with a single thumbs-up emoji. That was the entire yield of an entire month of silence. For 6 years, I had told myself this was simply what quiet, undemonstrative love looked like in a family like mine. That practical help counted more than sentiment, and that I was the one consistently showing up in the ways that mattered. 30 days of nothing ran a cleaner diagnostic on that theory than I ever could have designed myself. Every call I used to get had never really been about me at all. It had been about the roof, or the insurance card, or whatever the current thing happened to be. Always something. With no thing currently outstanding, I simply stopped registering. My own life, freed of $1,320 flowing out each month, and the guilt that used to flow back in to replace it, got strangely, almost guiltily good. I picked running back up, early mornings before my shift, my lungs slowly remembering a rhythm they'd forgotten. I cooked actual dinners for one, and sat down to eat them slowly, like someone with somewhere to be afterward that wasn't a hospital corridor. I let myself scroll through a real estate listing for a small house with a covered porch, and want it openly, for one full, uninterrupted minute. I started sleeping straight through the night again, too, for the first time in longer than I could clearly remember. And a coworker told me in early March that I looked lighter, which turned out to be exactly the right word. Though I still didn't have the complete picture yet of everything I stood to gain, and eventually lose again, on the other side of that particular scale. I hadn't realized how much of my rest had been quietly rationed out to a low, constant hum of financial vigilance. Some part of my brain permanently half awake and tracking the calendar toward the 28th, the way you'd track a fever that refused to fully break. Without that hum running underneath everything, I slept the way I remembered sleeping as a much younger woman, deep and dreamless, waking up genuinely rested instead of merely upright. It is a small thing to notice. Sleep, until you've gone 6 years without noticing it at all. The 28th came and went without incident. The bank's grace period, which I happen to know ran roughly 2.5 weeks past due, since knowing due dates the way other people know birthdays is simply part of my nature, expired quietly as well. Then, on an overcast Tuesday morning, my phone buzzed against the counter at the nurse's station while I was mid-sentence updating a chart. One glance at the screen and the entire floor around me seemed to drop into that particular hush that settles over a unit right before someone calls a code. The mortgage is due, it read. Nothing else. No greeting. No acknowledgement of what I might be feeling. Not even a question mark to soften it into something resembling concern. An entire month of complete silence, and the first words my mother chose to send me landed with all the warmth of an automated billing reminder. I stood there holding my phone for a long moment, my coffee cooling forgotten beside the monitor. 72 transfers that had never once earned a thank you, and a notarized document that had used the phrase with love to describe writing me out entirely. All of it rose up at once behind my eyes. I started composing something long, something about respect, about 6 years, about the $85,000 nobody in that family would say out loud. I deleted every version before I finished it. Justifying myself to people who profit from getting me wrong would only be one more bill I'd be covering, and I had already stopped covering those, so I sent back the only sentence that was completely, unambiguously true, and let it stand alone. Not my problem. I hit send, tucked the phone into my scrub pocket, and went back to finishing my rounds. My hands, I remember noticing, were almost perfectly steady. 11 minutes later, the phone started buzzing again, and it barely let up for 3 straight days. The messages arrived the way grief tends to arrive, moving through recognizable stages. If grief could somehow be reduced entirely to a missed payment schedule, first came flat disbelief. Did you see what I sent? Call me back. Then came a kind of forced lightness, as if the whole thing might still be some misunderstanding she could laugh off. By that evening, the tone had shifted into something sharper, the exact note I'd been quietly bracing for since the moment I hit send. After everything this family has done for you, I read that line twice, sitting on my own kitchen floor with my back against the cabinets, and let out one short, dry laugh, alone in an otherwise silent apartment. Then came the message clearly engineered to actually land. Your father's health can't handle this kind of stress. Think about what you're putting him through, that particular one. I allowed myself to read exactly once. I answered a single call that entire week, because it was my mother, and because 36 years of conditioning doesn't unwind itself in a single month no matter how firmly you've decided otherwise. Her voice on the phone was measured, reasonable, the tone she reserves for church committees. Family doesn't keep score, honey, she said. I looked out at the parking lot 3 stories below my apartment window. 40 minutes away from a house my money had been quietly propping up for 6 years running. Then why does the scoreboard only ever seem to show what I owe? I asked it gently. I meant it gently, too. She went quiet on the line for a second before suggesting we talk again once I'd settled down, which struck me as a curious thing for her to say, considering the only person whose volume had climbed at any point during that entire call belonged to her, not me. I told her good night and ended the call while she was still mid-sentence, the way you leave a meeting that never needed to happen in person to begin with. What she did next changed the entire shape of the conflict. She took a screenshot of my 2-word reply and forwarded it straight into the family group chat. By that weekend, my Aunt Sharon had assembled a whole narrative about me, ready for wide distribution, timed carefully for right after church, so she'd have an audience for her own patients. "Teresa," she said, in the exact register she uses running a bake sale. "I'm saying this with love. Family isn't a ledger. Hold on to that phrase for later. It resurfaces near the end of this story. And when it does real damage." She spent a good 11 minutes on duty and obligation, on how devastated her sister had been all weekend, carefully avoiding the word ungrateful while somehow managing to set it down on the table anyway. The way you'd set down a dish nobody had actually requested. I said, "Okay, Sharon, at steady, even intervals throughout. Staying calm costs nothing, and it tends to unsettle a certain type of person far more than shouting ever could, and I won't pretend I didn't take some quiet satisfaction in finding that out firsthand." By Monday, I had been removed from the family group chat entirely, not left of my own accord. Removed. A cousin in Roanoke I hadn't spoken to in years texted simply, "Heard you cut your parents off." Wow. Someone I'd met exactly once, at a funeral, quietly stopped following me online, which, devastating. One relative broke from the pattern completely. My Uncle Ray, my father's brother, a retired electrician who rarely strings together more than a few words in an entire year, sent me this unprompted. "Every roof has 2 sides worth hearing. Kiddo, call me whenever." Standing at my own kitchen counter, phone still in hand, I cried for the first time since walking out of that conference room, and it wasn't quite grief and it wasn't quite relief either. Something closer to what I feel on the unit when the one quiet relative in a loud room finally says the single true thing nobody else has been willing to say all day. I saved that message. I still have it. Monday morning. The front desk paged back to my unit. A visitor named Derek Voss was waiting in the lobby, asking for me by name. He stood there twisting a knit cap between both hands, dressed like someone trying hard to look sympathetic on short notice, having apparently driven 40 minutes on a workday, which for Derek qualifies as a genuine sacrifice. "Look, we just need to figure something out," he started, skipping straight past any greeting. "A couple months, tops. You know I'm good for it eventually." I asked exactly what he'd already figured out on his own, and the honest answer, once he stopped dancing around it, amounted to nothing beyond an assumption that I'd simply keep writing checks indefinitely. Then, because restraint has never once been part of Derek's skill set, he handed me the rest of the picture unprompted. He and his girlfriend had already put money down on a bigger place across town, 4 bedrooms, a school district they liked, for children they hadn't had yet but were clearly already budgeting around. "Based on how everything's set up right now," he said, gesturing vaguely, standing in my hospital's own lobby under my hospital's own sign. My parents were still alive, still eating dinner most nights in that house, and their nephew had already started spending an inheritance that didn't exist yet, purely inside his own head. "Let me see if I understand this correctly," I said, keeping my voice low, aware the receptionist was doing a poor job of pretending not to listen. "You're spending money from an estate that belongs to 2 people who are still very much alive." Something shifted across his face. "You always make it sound so awful," he said. "I make it sound accurate," I told him. Sometimes accuracy isn't comfortable. I finished my shift feeling fine, genuinely fine, right up until I got home that evening and caught sight of my own keys sitting on the counter. The brass one, cut back when I was 17 so I could let myself in after late practices without waking anyone, still hung there among the rest. Working it free took longer than it should have. some small mechanical resistance right at the very end, and once it came loose, I dropped it straight into the junk drawer without letting myself think about it further. My father called the next morning, which almost never happens. "There's a diner past the old hardware store," he said. "Come by around 11, just the two of us." I drove up and found him already settled into a corner booth, a cup of coffee in front of him that his doctor would not have approved of, sliding a laminated menu across the table like a peace offering. For a while he talked about nothing in particular: a neighbor's crooked new fence, some part he couldn't track down for an old outboard motor sitting in the garage. Then he set the cup down and told me something I had genuinely never heard before, not once in 36 years. Back when my mother's own mother got sick, he told me it was my mother who packed up and moved in to care for her. 4 years running. Overnight shifts, medication schedules, doctors before dawn, the whole exhausting weight of it. Sharon, meanwhile, stayed occupied with her own household, raising Derek, mailing the occasional card. My mother poured her entire wedding fund into that care, every last cent. And once her mother finally died, whatever remained of the estate ended up with Sharon's side of the family instead, on the reasoning that Sharon's need was greater. He stared down at his own hands for a long stretch. Not one person ever acknowledged what she'd sacrificed, he said. She spent years waiting to be recognized for it, and recognition never arrived. And somewhere along the way, a part of her simply shut off and stayed that way. I sat with that for a while, turning it over. My mother had once been exactly where I was now, 30 years earlier, and she'd come out the other side of it, convinced the whole arrangement had been correct, that her only real mistake had been expecting something back for it afterward. She wasn't repaying an old debt of her own through me. She was passing it forward, with interest quietly added on top. None of that excused a single choice she'd made. It did explain nearly all of them. And I've learned, in that diner booth and in a great many hospital rooms since, that both of those things can be true about the same person at once, without canceling each other out. My father reached across the table and set his hand over mine. "I'm going to make this right," he said. "Just give me a little time." Getting up to leave took him 2 tries. Both hands braced flat against the table edge before his legs finally consented to hold his weight. I watched him make his way out to the truck, slower than I remembered him moving a few months earlier, and sat alone in that booth a while longer with coffee going cold, which seemed to be happening a lot lately. Every time someone in my family handed me something heavier than the cup itself. I thought about my mother decades before I existed, doing this exact same arithmetic. Nights, medications, a wedding fund spent to nothing, silence where gratitude should have stood. Families don't invent their patterns from scratch. They inherit them like a bad hip, then hand them down again without meaning to. The same way my father handed me a key instead of an apology, because a key was the only language of love he'd ever been fluent in. I didn't forgive her that morning, and I want to be honest about that, because forgiveness gets reached for too quickly in stories like this one, as if understanding a wound automatically obligates you to keep bleeding from it indefinitely. What I felt instead was closer to a diagnosis. I finally had a name for what I was dealing with, and a diagnosis, whatever else it accomplishes, at least tells you clearly what you are not personally responsible for curing. By the time summer arrived, the situation on Larkspur Lane had continued deteriorating exactly the way I'd expected, quietly and without anyone bothering to intervene, through my Uncle Ray. Since he'd essentially become my only remaining source of information, I heard that the bank had finally sent formal notice, 90 days past due, using terms I only ever encountered in the financial packets I help other families read at the hospital, sitting now on my mother's own hallway table beneath her small ceramic figurine of clasped, praying hands, at a 4th of July gathering, apparently. My mother explained the whole thing away to relatives as a clerical error on the bank's part, delivering the lie with a completely straight face while the grill hissed away in the background. A $4,200 mistake, she called it, soon to be resolved. Sharon organized a sit-down about the growing crisis. I wasn't invited, and I know precisely how that meeting concluded because Ray relayed it to me afterward in the careful, neutral tone of someone reporting conditions from a place he was relieved not to live in anymore. Their collective decision, verbatim, went like this. Teresa will eventually come around. She always does. Not a single person suggested reaching out to me directly. Nobody floated the possibility that the lawyer's office had gotten something badly wrong. Just an assumption, stated as flatly as a fact of nature, that I would eventually fold, the way water eventually finds its way downhill. Because in their eyes, that had always been my function. Not a daughter so much as infrastructure, something you build an entire household's foundation around and never once think to inspect, because it has simply never failed before. Derek, meanwhile, heir apparent to the whole estate, contributed exactly nothing toward those mounting arrears the entire summer. Not $1. He had a deposit down on a 4-bedroom house and couldn't locate a single month's payment for the roof he expected to inherit. I stayed out of all of it. I ran my usual miles, worked my usual shifts, kept the one houseplant on my windowsill alive and let that be enough for a while. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday in August, my phone rang at 4 a.m. A call at that hour is never carrying good news. It was my mother's number, and whatever composure she usually kept in her voice had completely evaporated. Just fear, raw and unfiltered. It's your father, Riverside General. Come now, I had clothes on and was merging onto the highway inside 10 minutes. Strange. What runs through your head in that kind of dark, wipers going, adrenaline doing most of the driving for you? Not once did I think about the trust, or the 72 payments or anything financial at all. Cutting off their bills had cost me my place at that family's table, but it had never once, not for a single day, made me stop being his daughter. That distinction, the one my family could never quite hold on to, turned out to be the whole point of everything that had happened between us. Acute respiratory failure, the pulmonologist told me eventually. His lungs had been losing an argument for years, and that morning they finally stopped fighting it. Intensive care at 5 a.m. has a particular hush to it. Soft alarms and blue light. A landscape I know intimately from the other side of the glass. This time I stood on the family side instead. My mother watched me step off the elevator, and something moved across her face in stages. Relief first, then guilt, then, unmistakably, the same old accounting instinct reasserting itself. "Did you think to bring your checkbook?" she asked. "Or just yourself?" I stood there a moment before answering. "Just myself," I told her. "There isn't anything else left to bring." I walked past her, sat beside my father, and held his hand carefully around the lines running into it until sunrise crept over the parking structure outside. Near dawn, his eyes opened briefly, and he pulled me in close enough that I had to put my ear almost against his lips to catch what little air he had left to spend on words. "You were never the debt, Teresa. That was the whole of it. No apology. No explanation about trusts or lawyers or houses. Just that one sentence, spent like it was the only currency he had left worth using." His hand went slack in mine soon after, and he slept, the monitor keeping its same indifferent rhythm through everything. 2 days later, he passed quietly in his sleep. The nurse on duty told me it had been peaceful, and having said that same sentence to more families than I could count over the years, I chose, standing on the receiving end of it for once, to believe her completely. Grief. I've come to understand. doesn't move the way a recovering patient does. Admission to stabilization to discharge in any order you could chart in advance. 3 days after the funeral, I went back to my own floor simply because I didn't know what else to do with a Tuesday, and I stood outside a patient's door holding a chart, unable to remember for a full 10 seconds why I was even holding it. A coworker eased it out of my hands and sent me home, and I sat in the parking garage for the better part of an hour before I could make myself turn the key. Whatever my father had meant by fixing things stayed permanently unfixed. A tool set down mid-repair, waiting on a hand that would never come back to finish the job. I told myself that was simply how it would remain. I had no idea yet that his workshop still had one more thing left to tell me, and that it would say it far more clearly than he ever managed while he was still alive to try. We laid my father to rest on a Thursday that had no business being as sunny as it was. Afterward, the church basement filled with casseroles and weak coffee and relatives balancing paper plates. And I circulated with the carafe now and then, purely because occupied hands tremble less than idle ones. Sharon's eulogy, I'll admit, had been genuinely moving. But grief plus a captive audience apparently proved too tempting to leave alone for long. Later, positioned where her voice would carry, she informed a cluster of aunts that some people apparently had money for new cars, but nothing left over for their own dying father's roof. Forks paused mid-bite. Every head in that circle turned, almost in unison, toward me. My car, for the record, was 7 years old and bought used. But a good story needs props more than it ever needs facts. I felt the flush climb up my neck, felt the old wiring light up, the instinct to defend, to explain, to itemize every single payment out loud in front of a room of people balancing paper plates. And then I felt something colder and newer take the wheel instead. I set the coffee carafe down on the nearest table, looking straight across the room at Sharon. I spoke barely above a whisper. Calm and unhurried. Why don't you ask my mother what that refinance 6 years ago actually paid for? Nothing more than that. I picked the carafe back up, topped off Mrs. Fenwick's cup, and felt the whole room hold its breath collectively, because a good half of the people standing there had never once, in their entire lives, heard that house connected to the word refinance. Something briefly drained out of Sharon's expression, gone almost as fast as it appeared. Out on the church steps 10 minutes later, my Uncle Ray caught up to me, coffee in hand. What refinance? Teresa. I laid it out for him right there on the steps, using the flat, deliberate delivery I rely on for a hard diagnosis, the one register that has never once let me down. Derek's shop had started failing 6 years earlier. My parents refinanced a house nearly paid off and handed him $85,000. Sitting right there in county records for anyone curious enough to look. A new loan, $1,320 a month on a dock worker's pension. The bank gave them 30 days, and I stepped in and covered every payment after that so the house wouldn't go under. 72 payments, stretched across 6 full years. Add up the cell phones, her car insurance, the roof, and the whole running total climbed past $114,000. A couple of cousins had wandered closer by that point, the way people gather around an accident scene out of pure instinct. I pulled up my banking app and simply turned the phone around to face them. One glance was all it took. No commentary needed from me. Column after column of identical outgoing transfers, always landing on the 28th, receding further back in time than the screen had room to display in a single scroll. Ray studied that screen without saying a word for a good while. 40 years spent wiring houses teaches a person exactly how to locate the one point where a circuit has silently gone bad. And I could see him tracing that same instinct straight through what he was looking at, his jaw set. "You paid for the roof they were signing out from under you," he said, and handed the phone back like it was evidence because it was, by Wednesday, my cousin Priya, who pulls property records for a living, had confirmed the whole thing on her lunch break date. Amount. All of it public and searchable. She dropped a screenshot of the recorder's page into the chat thread I'd been removed from. No comment attached. Sleep wasn't happening that night, so I drove out to Larkspur Lane instead, to the garage door that was still the only one on that property I had a working key for. The air inside carried every year of my childhood at once, engine grease and sawdust layered over cold concrete. I found the pull chain light my father had never gotten around to upgrading, and I unlocked the steel tool chest with the key he'd pressed into my hand in that parking lot months earlier. Inside, there were no tools at all. There was a small spiral notebook, his handwriting on the first page, shakier than I remembered it. A running list of amounts he'd apparently meant to pay me back. Dates going back years, some of them crossed out and recalculated, none of them ever actually sent. And underneath the list, one final line. "Don't ever sign anything financial you haven't read all the way through yourself." I learned that lesson far too late. I sat down on his old workbench stool and read it 3 times, and I understood, finally, that this had been his fix. Not a signature, not an apology out loud, a warning written down in advance for a daughter he already knew would need it again someday. I cried there for a while, the kind of crying nobody is meant to witness, sleeve pressed against my mouth, sitting in a thin layer of sawdust at nearly 2 a.m. Then I stopped, because some part of me knew he would have wanted me to check the joinery on the half-finished birdhouse still clamped to the bench beside me, and I did, running my thumb along a seam he'd sanded smooth before he ran out of time to finish it. It was perfect, of course. He never did sloppy work, not with wood, only ever with the things he couldn't hold in his 2 hands. I locked the notebook back inside the chest and turned off the light, walking to my car under an ordinary summer sky. I understood something I hadn't let myself say out loud. Not even to Ray. My father hadn't failed to protect me from love. He had failed to teach that love a spine. And by the time he tried growing one, in secret, on a workbench, he had run out of years to practice using it. I promised myself, right there in that driveway, that I would not make the same mistake. By midweek, the version of events circulating through my extended family had flipped entirely, and my Aunt Sharon discovered firsthand what it feels like to become the subject of a group chat instead of its loudest voice. Family stories survive right up until somebody pulls the actual paperwork. Sharon kept trying anyway. It was help, plain and simple, she told anyone who'd listen. But each defense landed weaker than the last, the way explanations do once real numbers sit in a public database for anyone to search. Autumn brought the foreclosure process into motion, methodical the way court-supervised proceedings tend to be. A filed complaint, a response window measured in weeks, eventually a judgment, then a scheduled auction on the courthouse steps. Paperwork attached to every stage. I understood that calendar the way I understand a normal vital sign range, and for the first time, it was counting down against the house I'd grown up in. Every possible escape route my mother tried reaching for turned out to be nailed shut. Borrowing from relatives was off the table, since everyone now knew exactly where the original $85,000 had gone, and nobody wanted to pour good money after it. Listing the house before the sale wasn't an option either, according to my mother, who told Ray she refused to let strangers walk through Walter's home, apparently preferring the actual strangers the county was about to send in regardless. Derek had his own collapse to manage by then. The deposit on his new place was gone for good, forfeited outright, and the credit cards funding his imaginary future had started calling with real consequences attached. Through it all, not a single person in that family picked up the phone to say the word sorry to me. They brainstormed every conceivable way to scrape the money back together. Not once did anyone brainstorm an apology instead. So when Mr. Ellery's office called again, one bitter Tuesday in January, I knew two things before I even picked up. Their options had run dry, and I was the only one still standing. Same building, same conference room, same long table, even the same bad coffee somehow. My mother arrived in her good coat, Sharon beside her, noticeably subdued. Mr. Ellery explained plainly that, as the surviving spouse, my mother held sole power to revise her portion of the trust however she chose. The proposal itself was simple. Bring the loan current before the sheriff's sale. Cover roughly $22,000 in arrears and fees, and the foreclosure would be dropped entirely. The house safe, in exchange, provided I covered that amount. My mother had a signed amendment ready to execute right there that afternoon, already sitting drafted in a folder in front of Mr. Ellery. Ownership of the house on Larkspur Lane would pass to me outright. Signed. Notarized. Witnessed by everyone present. 6 years of wanting exactly this. Contained in a single folder within arm's reach. My mother took my hand between both of hers, warm as always, eyes shining. See, it was always meant to be yours in the end. Nothing has to change, sweetheart. The identical phrase from the day they erased me, now repackaged as comfort. I felt it settle somewhere cold and unmistakably clear inside my chest. Everyone at that table believed they were watching a reunion take shape. I seemed to be the only one who noticed exactly what price tag was still attached to it. I asked for a day to think it over and drove home by myself. That night, I did what I always do when a decision feels impossible, split a legal pad into 2 columns. Column 1 held the house, the magnolia tree my father had planted the year I was born, pencil marks tracking my height on a door frame, my mother's hand in mine again. $22,000, which I actually had sitting in savings, money I'd been setting aside for a place of my own someday. Column 2 held walking away, keeping the money, losing the house permanently, and quite possibly losing her too. This time for good. Reading back over both columns near midnight, I noticed something. Every line in column 1 was a noun. House, tree, door frame, mother. Every line in column 2 was a fact. 72 payments and not one thank you. A trust that erased me and called it love. 30 silent days, and then a due date arriving by text message instead of a phone call. Nothing has to change, sweetheart. Nouns versus facts. The nouns were gorgeous, every one. That's simply what nouns do. The house had never been the actual inheritance. I had been. And they had already spent every last bit of me. The next afternoon I placed a single envelope on that same table. No money inside it. Just one printed page. A summary I'd built myself the night before. Every transfer across 6 years listed by date and amount. 72 entries. And where a running balance should have appeared at the bottom. Only 3 words. Paid in full. Beside the page sat the brass house key. Off my ring for months by then. I'm turning down the reinstatement, I said. As level as I have ever managed to sound about anything. That house was never actually the inheritance. I was... And all of you spent me... I turned toward my aunt before standing. You told me once that family isn't a ledger. You weren't wrong. It isn't one. But you're all the ones who kept mailing me the bill regardless. I walked out of that office and didn't look back once. 6 weeks later, the county auctioned the house off the courthouse steps. I skipped it. Instead, I drove my mother myself, in a rented pickup, everything she owned packed into 14 boxes, to a senior apartment across town, and told her plainly, somewhere along that drive, that I'd keep carrying boxes and filling out forms for the rest of her life, but I would never again hand over $1 to earn a place in this family. That spring, I put my own name on the title of a small house with a covered porch outside Richmond, set my father's tool chest on the mantel, and let myself believe, for a while, that the hardest lesson of my life was finally behind me. I want to be honest about what came after, because I've noticed people expect a clean ending right about here, and life almost never obliges that particular expectation. 2 years passed. My mother and I found something small and true on Sunday afternoons. An hour of coffee, nothing more, and I stopped waiting for it to become anything else. I thought that was the whole lesson. I thought I had finally learned how to spot the difference between love and a bill disguised as one. Then I met a man named Marcus Whitfield, gentle, patient, a financial advisor who never once mentioned money in our first 6 months together. And I mistook his silence on the subject for proof he'd never once tried to use it against me. I was wrong about that too. I just hadn't learned yet that the second lesson almost never wears the same face as the first, and that the people who hurt you worst are rarely careless enough to repeat themselves exactly. Marcus studied me the way I study a chart before a shift, quietly, thoroughly, and I mistook that attention for devotion instead of what it actually was. 2 years is enough time for a burn to stop hurting and start looking, from a distance, almost like a scar you can be proud of. By then, I had settled into the little house with the covered porch, promoted again at work, moving into a role that put me at the head of care coordination for 3 units instead of 1. My mother and I had found a rhythm that fit inside a single-hour coffee at her place most Sundays. Conversation that stayed carefully on the surface of things, weather, her neighbor's cat, a sermon she'd liked, small, imperfect, honest, in its limited way, for the first time in longer than either of us wanted to admit. I met Marcus Whitfield at a hospital fundraising gala I'd been roped into attending. One of those events where everyone in scrubs trades them temporarily for something formal and stands around a ballroom pretending the small talk isn't excruciating. He introduced himself as an independent financial advisor, somebody's +1 who'd wandered over to the dessert table at the same moment I had, and what struck me first wasn't anything he said about money. It's that an entire conversation went by, easily 20 minutes, without him mentioning it once. Given everything I'd survived 2 years earlier, that omission felt like the safest thing a stranger had ever offered me. Marcus turned out to be patient in a way I hadn't experienced from anyone, romantically or otherwise. He never pushed, never rushed a single stage of anything between us. He asked good questions and actually listened to the answers, the kind of listening that makes a person feel understood rather than simply heard. A year into dating, he proposed on a Tuesday. No fanfare. Just the 2 of us on my own porch with the tool chest visible through the window behind us, and I said yes, without a flicker of hesitation. It wasn't until we started actually planning a wedding that money entered the conversation at all, and even then, it arrived gently, practically, the way a person raises a topic they've clearly thought through in advance. "We should think about combining things eventually," he said one evening. Not specifying what things, letting the vagueness do the comforting work. A few weeks later, more specifically, he'd noticed my mortgage rate was higher than it needed to be, and he had contacts, people who could get me refinanced at something meaningfully better before the wedding, saving real money we could put toward an actual future together instead of a bank's margin. To make it official, to let him act on my behalf while he handled the paperwork, he needed something simple. A limited power of attorney, just for financial matters, just temporary, just until the refinance closed. I want to be honest about the exact moment this became a request rather than an idea, because it matters. It came during a stretch when my hospital was 3 nurses short on nights, flu season tearing through the region, and I was pulling back-to-back double shifts just to keep my own unit staffed. Marcus brought it up gently during one of the only evenings we actually saw each other that whole month, sliding the paperwork across my kitchen table between bites of takeout, framing it as one less thing for me to think about during an already impossible stretch. I remember feeling, in that specific moment, something close to gratitude. For 6 years, I had been the one person managing every piece of paperwork in every relationship I had. Here, finally, was somebody offering to carry a piece of it for me instead. I told him I'd read through it properly once things calmed down. He said, of course, no rush at all, and left the document sitting on my counter, patient as ever, exactly the way he was patient about everything. Looking back, I can see now how carefully that patience had been built, layer by layer, over almost 3 years of never once asking for anything before I was ready to give it. Patience like that doesn't happen by accident in a person. It's cultivated, practiced, deployed at exactly the moments it will do the most good. And I had no framework at the time for recognizing deliberate patience as anything other than genuine character. I'd spent 6 years learning to spot greed dressed up as love. Nobody had taught me yet what calculation dressed up as patience looked like from the inside. My coworkers adored him, which felt, at the time, like confirmation rather than a separate data point worth examining. He brought coffee to the nurses' station on his way to pick me up from late shifts, remembered the names of people I'd mentioned exactly once, asked Jamie, one of the newer nurses on my floor, thoughtful questions about her nursing school debt, and seemed to genuinely care about the answer. Everyone said the same thing about him. Some version of, "You finally found someone who actually deserves you." And I let myself believe it completely, the way you let yourself believe good news after a long stretch of the other kind. The wedding planning moved forward through that autumn in its ordinary, exhausting way. Venues and guest lists and a dress I hadn't fully committed to yet, and underneath all of it sat that single folder on my kitchen counter, patient, unhurried, waiting for exactly the night I was too tired to read it properly before I finally signed it. I think about that folder often now, how unremarkable it looked sitting there among the mail and the takeout menus, how easily it blended into the general clutter of a life being lived at full speed. Nothing about it announced itself as dangerous. That, I've come to understand, is precisely the point of documents like that one. Danger that announces itself gets read carefully. Danger that looks like ordinary paperwork gets signed on the way out the door. The night I actually signed it, I'd just come off a 14-hour shift that had included 2 rapid responses and a patient death nobody had seen coming. The kind of shift that hollows you out somewhere behind the sternum and leaves you running on fumes and muscle memory alone. Marcus met me in the hospital parking lot instead of waiting at home, which felt considerate at the time. One less thing between me and sleep. He had the folder with him, the pen already uncapped, and he spread the paperwork flat against the hood of my car under the sodium lights, walking me through it in a calm, unhurried voice that matched every other conversation we'd ever had. Somewhere in the back of my exhausted brain, a small voice tried to surface. Something about my father's notebook. The line about never signing anything financial without reading it all the way through myself. I remember the thought arriving, and I remember it leaving again almost as fast, crowded out by the simple physical fact that I had been awake for 19 hours, and my hand was already moving toward the pen before my judgment had fully caught up to the moment. I signed. Marcus kissed my forehead, told me I'd done the smart thing, and said he'd handle everything from there so I could finally get some sleep. Driving home that night, windows cracked to keep myself alert, I remember feeling almost giddy with relief. The specific relief of setting something down after carrying it too long without realizing how heavy it had become. For 6 years after my father died, I had been the only signature that mattered on anything, the only person double-checking every number before it left my hands, Marcus asking to carry a small piece of that weight had felt, in the moment, less like a request and more like a gift I hadn't known I needed. I fell asleep that night faster than I had in months, and I slept through until my alarm without once waking to check the clock, which for a chronic light sleeper like me counted as its own small miracle. Weeks passed in the ordinary blur of wedding planning and back-to-back shifts. And then Marcus brought good news home one evening, practically glowing with it. The refinance had gone through cleanly. My interest rate had dropped meaningfully. I'd start seeing the difference reflected in my monthly accounts within a month, easily enough saved to cover the honeymoon we'd spent weeks quietly debating whether we could even afford. I remember hearing that something close to relief layered over something close to pride. I had trusted somebody with a piece of my financial life for the first time since my father died, and it had apparently paid off exactly the way trust is supposed to. A few weeks after that, checking my accounts idly one night while Marcus showered down the hall, I noticed my savings balance sitting lower than I expected, several $1,000s short of where my own careful mental math insisted it should have landed. When I mentioned it the next morning, Marcus had an answer ready before I'd even finished the sentence. Something about a temporary processing fee tied to the refinance, standard and fully refundable. Nothing to worry about. He'd already flagged it with the lender himself. The explanation came so smoothly, so immediately, delivered with the easy confidence of a man reciting something he'd already rehearsed more than once, that I filed my own hesitation away as simple tiredness and let it go without pressing further. I had spent 38 years being the person who caught every discrepancy, who chased down every number that didn't reconcile, and for the first time in my adult life, I had someone else volunteering to do that chasing on my behalf. It did not occur to me, not yet, to ask myself why that particular relief felt so unfamiliar in my own chest. I want to say, looking back now, that some part of me sensed it even then. The truth is more complicated than that. Some part of me sensed it and chose, quite deliberately, to file the feeling under exhaustion instead of instinct, because believing in Marcus was easier than doing the math myself, and for a few months, easier won. There is a particular kind of tired that settles into a person after years of vigilance, a tired that has nothing to do with sleep and everything to do with never once getting to set the burden down. I had been vigilant about my parents for 6 years, and vigilant about my own healing for 2 more after that, and somewhere in the space Marcus occupied, I had quietly decided that vigilance itself was the thing I was finally allowed to retire. It is an uncomfortable thing to admit, but I let a little of my own judgment go slack precisely because I was so exhausted from having sharpened it for so long against people who deserved it. And I mistook that exhaustion for having finally found someone safe enough to stop sharpening it against it all. The wedding date crept closer through those weeks. Invitations mailed, a caterer booked, and I told myself, whenever a stray flicker of doubt surfaced, that this was simply what trust was supposed to feel like after everything I'd survived. I had spent so long being the only vigilant person in every relationship I had that I no longer knew how to distinguish real safety from the simple relief of finally getting to rest. The call came on a Wednesday evening in early spring. An unfamiliar number I nearly let go to voicemail out of sheer habit. Since unfamiliar numbers usually meant a pharmacy reminder or somebody's extended car warranty, instead, a woman's voice, unsteady but determined underneath it, asked if she had reached Teresa, the one engaged to Marcus Whitfield. When I confirmed it, she told me her name was Renee, and that she used to be married to him. I want to be honest about my very first reaction, because it says something true about how thoroughly I'd let my guard down. My first instinct wasn't curiosity. It was mild irritation, the assumption that I was about to receive some bitter ex-wife's version of events, colored by whatever resentment lingers after a marriage ends. I nearly told her politely that I appreciated the call but didn't need this. Something in her voice made me hold off and actually listen instead. Renee explained that she'd heard, through a mutual acquaintance, that Marcus had gotten engaged again, and that she'd debated for weeks whether reaching out was even her business anymore. She said she wasn't calling to relitigate her own marriage or paint herself as some innocent victim, because their divorce had been complicated in ways that weren't entirely his fault either. What she was calling about, specifically, was a pattern, one she recognized with an uncomfortable clarity the moment she heard I worked long, demanding hospital shifts. During their marriage, she told me, Marcus had asked her to sign a limited power of attorney too, timed almost exactly the way mine had been, during a stretch when she'd been consumed by caring for her dying father. He'd framed it, she said, as taking one burden off her plate during an impossible season, handling paperwork so she wouldn't have to think about anything financial while she grieved. Months later, she discovered a home equity loan on the townhouse they'd shared, drawn down almost entirely, money she never saw a cent of and never fully understood the destination of. She didn't accuse him outright of anything with me. She simply laid out what had happened to her plainly, the way you'd report a set of symptoms to a doctor without trying to diagnose yourself first, and let me draw whatever conclusions I was going to draw. "I'm not trying to blow up your engagement," she said, near the end of the call, her voice steadier than it had been at the start. I just kept thinking about what I would have wanted somebody to tell me back when it was happening to me. Nobody did. I found out from a bank statement, months after the damage was already done, and by then there wasn't much left to salvage. She told me she didn't need anything from me. Not an apology, not a promise to believe her, just that she'd be able to live with herself for having said something rather than staying quiet a second time. Then she gave me her number, told me to use it or not, and let the call end there, without pushing for anything further. I sat on my kitchen floor for a long while after we hung up, back against the same cabinets I'd cried against once before, turning her story over from every angle I could manage. Marcus was upstairs, home early for once, humming something tuneless while he unpacked groceries, utterly unaware that a woman from his past had just handed his fiancée a mirror. I told myself, more than once that night, that divorced people rewrite history constantly. That hurt has a way of reshaping memory until the other person becomes a villain clean enough to hate without complication. I have watched enough families do exactly that in hospital hallways to know it's a real phenomenon and not just something I was inventing to protect myself from an uncomfortable truth. I thanked her, mostly on reflex, and hung up feeling something complicated I couldn't immediately name. Part of me wanted to dismiss the whole call as exactly what I'd first assumed, a wounded ex-wife unable to let go. But another part of me, the part that spends every working shift cross-referencing symptoms against known patterns, had already quietly filed away every detail she'd given me, unable to stop noticing how precisely her story mirrored my own. I didn't confront Marcus that night. I told myself I needed more information first. That one phone call from a stranger wasn't evidence of anything a fair-minded person could act on yet. But I saved Renee's number before I went to bed. In a separate contact I labeled, cautiously, with nothing more than a question mark. And some quiet, professional part of me, the part trained over 15 years to trust a pattern even when I badly wanted not to, had already started keeping score again without my full permission. I went to work the next morning and functioned normally, or close enough to normally that nobody on my unit seemed to notice anything different. But underneath the ordinary rhythm of rounds and charting, I kept circling back to one detail Renee had mentioned almost in passing, that she'd only discovered the missing money by accident, months after the fact, buried in a routine statement she almost hadn't bothered opening. It was such a small, specific detail, The kind of thing a person doesn't invent when they're simply trying to manufacture a grievance. Invented stories tend to arrive polished, dramatic, easy to picture. Real ones arrive exactly the way hers had. Slightly disorganized, full of the kind of mundane specificity that only comes from actually having lived through something. That night, lying awake next to Marcus's steady breathing, I made a decision I didn't tell him about. I would look at the numbers myself, quietly, the same way I'd once taught myself to look at 72 transfers I'd spent 6 years refusing to add up. If there was nothing there, I told myself, no harm done, and I'd never have to bring Renee's name into our life together at all. I chose a Thursday afternoon when Marcus had a standing golf outing with clients, a block of hours I knew was reliably his, and sat down at my kitchen table with my laptop and the same instinct I'd once turned on my parents' finances 2 years earlier, except this time pointed at the man I was supposed to be marrying in 5 months. I started with the mortgage account itself, the one Marcus had supposedly refinanced. The new interest rate was real, exactly as advertised, a genuine improvement over my old terms. For a moment, relief washed through me so completely I nearly closed the laptop right there, ready to feel foolish for doubting him at all. Then I noticed a second loan listed beneath it, one I didn't recognize, filed under the same property address. A home equity line of credit, opened the same week as the refinance, drawn down almost to its full limit within a month of being opened. $58,400, sitting against the equity in the house I had bought entirely on my own 2 years earlier, the house with my father's tool chest on the mantel. I sat very still for a long moment, the way I imagine a patient's family sits still in the seconds right after a diagnosis lands, before the sound comes back into the room. I want to describe exactly what happened in my body in that moment, because it matters for understanding everything I did next. My hands did not shake. My breathing did not change in any way a monitor would have flagged. 15 years of training myself to stay level in the worst moments of other people's lives had apparently rewired something in me permanently. Because even discovering this, even staring at a number that represented a betrayal I hadn't yet fully processed, my body simply executed the only protocol it knew: assess, document, do not react yet. I opened a blank document and started writing down everything I found: timestamps, account numbers, the exact date the equity line had opened relative to the date I'd signed that limited power of attorney on the hood of my own car in a hospital parking lot. I cross-referenced it against my calendar from that period, confirming the timeline matched precisely what Renee had described happening to her, down to the pattern of exhaustion Marcus had exploited in both of us. Once I had the full picture assembled, cold and complete on the screen in front of me, I picked up my phone and called the number I'd saved under a question mark 2 weeks earlier. Odette Kim answered on the third ring, warm and professional. The loan officer who'd handled the closing on my house originally, and who I still occasionally emailed with questions about escrow. I told her I needed to verify something on my account, keeping my voice as level as I could manage, and asked her to walk me through exactly how a second lien could have been placed on my property using a limited power of attorney I'd signed for an entirely different purpose. There was a pause on her end long enough that I understood, before she said a single word, that whatever she was about to tell me would not be reassuring. "Let me pull the file," she said finally, and I could hear keys clicking on her end while I sat frozen at my own kitchen table, staring at the number 58,400 as if staring hard enough might change it. When she came back on the line, her voice had shifted into something more careful, more procedural, the tone people use right before they tell you something is about to become a formal problem rather than a private one. "Teresa, I'm looking at the equity line now. It was processed as a separate transaction from the refinance. using a power of attorney document that Mr. Whitfield submitted along with your original signature page. Everything on the surface looks procedurally clean, but I want to ask you directly. And I need an honest answer, because it matters for what happens next. Did you authorize a second loan against this property? In addition to the refinance, I told her the truth. I had authorized him to handle paperwork related to a rate reduction. Nothing else. I had never seen, never signed, never even been told about a second lien against my own house. Odette went quiet again for a moment, and when she spoke next, her voice had dropped into something almost gentle, the register people use when they're about to confirm the worst version of what you already suspect. That's going to matter a great deal, she said, because if that's accurate, what we're looking at here isn't a paperwork error. I'd strongly recommend you start documenting everything on your end, today, before you talk to him about any of this. And Teresa, I say this as someone who has seen it happen before, more than once. Don't sign anything else. For anyone. Until this is fully sorted out. I thanked her, hung up, and sat in the silence of my own kitchen for a long time afterward. The late afternoon light shifting slowly across the table, while I let the full shape of what I'd just learned settle into me. Somewhere across town, Marcus was finishing his 18th hole, probably already composing some easy, charming story about his round for when he got home, utterly unaware that the woman waiting for him had just spent an afternoon quietly assembling the exact kind of evidence file she'd once built against her own mother. I thought, sitting there, about my father's notebook, still sitting on my own mantel 2 years later, that single warning written in his shaking hand. I had read it, understood it, even quoted it to myself more than once, and I had still signed something I hadn't fully read. Because I was tired. Because I trusted. Because trusting Marcus had felt, for a while, like the reward I'd earned for surviving everything that came before him. I understood now, sitting in that fading light, that trust earned nothing. It only ever cost something. And the bill for this one was already $58,000 and climbing. Marcus came home a little after 6, tan from the golf course, in genuinely good spirits, and I let him get through exactly one sentence about his round before I set my laptop on the table between us, screen already open to the loan documents. I talked to Odette Kim today, I said. Walk me through the home equity line. I watched something move behind his eyes, fast, almost too fast to catch if I hadn't spent 15 years reading exactly that kind of flicker on people trying to control their face in front of bad news. It was there and gone in under a second, replaced by a version of concern so smooth it could have passed for genuine confusion to anyone who hadn't been specifically trained to look past it. Okay, he said slowly, sitting down across from me like a man settling in for a reasonable conversation. I can explain that. What followed was not an explanation so much as a performance, delivered in the same calm, patient voice he'd used for every conversation we'd ever had, the voice that had made me feel so safe for almost 3 years. The market had shifted unexpectedly, he said. He'd had an investment opportunity fall through at a bad moment. He'd intended to pay it back quietly, before I ever needed to know. And he was, frankly, a little hurt that I'd gone digging behind his back instead of simply asking him directly. I let him finish completely before I asked the only question that actually mattered. Where did the money go? Marcus. The performance held for another minute or two, vague references to a business venture, a friend who'd needed help, numbers that shifted slightly every time he repeated them. It cracked, finally, on a detail so small I almost missed its significance. A mention of covering a debt to someone named Danny before the end of the month, spoken with a flash of genuine panic that didn't match anything else he'd said all evening. I recognized the shape of what I was looking at before he finished the sentence. I had spent enough years around families whose loved ones struggled with addiction to know exactly what kind of debt makes a calm man's voice crack like that. I asked him directly, and after a long silence, he told me the truth, or at least a version close enough to it. A gambling habit. Going back years. One he'd apparently kept successfully hidden from nearly everyone in his life, funded quietly through exactly this kind of maneuver whenever it caught up with him. Renee's story slotted into place around his instantly and completely. What struck me most, sitting there absorbing all of it, was how quickly Marcus pivoted from confession to counterattack once he realized denial wasn't working. He told me I was overreacting. He said I'd always been guarded, suspicious, unable to fully let anyone in, and that this, all of it, was really just further proof of a trust issue I'd brought into the relationship long before he ever touched my accounts. He said it gently, almost kindly, in the exact tone that had once made me feel understood, and for one disorienting moment, some old, exhausted part of me actually reached for the possibility that he might be right. Then I thought about Renee, describing this precise maneuver over the phone weeks earlier. A stranger who owed me nothing, accurately predicting the exact shape of my own fiancé's defense before he'd even used it on me. That single detail was what finally, completely, snapped the last thread of doubt I'd been holding on to. This wasn't a trust issue of mine. It was a technique of his, tested and refined on at least one other woman before me, deployed now with the same practiced confidence a surgeon brings to a procedure they've performed 100 times. I closed the laptop. "I'm not the problem here. Marcus," I said, as level as I've ever managed to sound about anything in my life. "You are..." He didn't argue that particular point, which told me almost as much as anything he'd said all evening. Instead, he shifted again, quieter this time, into something that sounded almost like genuine grief. Telling me he'd meant to tell me eventually, that he'd been planning to pay everything back before the wedding so I'd never have to know any of this had happened at all, as though the plan to deceive me successfully somehow mitigated the deception itself. I sat with that logic for a moment, turning it over the way I'd turn over an unfamiliar diagnosis, testing it from every angle before deciding whether it held together. It didn't. A lie you intend to get away with is still a lie, regardless of how sincerely you hoped never to get caught. I asked him how long the debt had actually been going on, and the number he finally gave me, hesitant and clearly still shaved down from the truth, was years, not months, stretching back through his marriage to Renee and likely well before that. I asked whether there had been other loans, other women, other quiet uses of someone else's trust to keep the whole arrangement afloat. And for the first time all evening, he didn't have a smooth answer ready. He just looked at me. And in that silence I understood I would probably never get the complete accounting. Only the pieces he decided were survivable to admit. I sat there a long moment longer, watching a man I had been planning to marry in 5 months become, in the space of one conversation, a stranger wearing a familiar face. Grief moved through me first, sharp and real. Grief for the version of this relationship I'd believed I was building. Right behind it came something steadier, something I recognized immediately because I'd felt its exact shape once before, standing in a different kitchen 2 years earlier with a different betrayal spread out on a different table. I knew, sitting there, precisely what I needed to do next. And I knew I needed to do it clear-eyed rather than furious, the same way I had learned to do everything that actually mattered. I moved faster than I had 2 years earlier, and I think that speed itself tells you something about how differently the two betrayals sat inside me. There was no 30-day cushion this time, No careful legal pad of pros and cons weighed out past midnight. Some lessons, once truly learned, don't need to be relearned slowly. I called the notary's office first thing the next morning and revoked the power of attorney formally, in writing, with a witness present, closing the exact door Marcus had walked through to open that second loan in the first place. From there, I moved through every password I shared with him, banking, email, the smart lock on my own front door, changing each one methodically the way I had once canceled 4 auto payments in 90 flat minutes. I called Odette Kim back and formally requested an internal review of the loan file, and she connected me directly with the bank's fraud department that same afternoon. I slid the engagement ring off that evening and set it on the kitchen table between us, the same table where he'd once spread refinance paperwork under a promise of saving us money. I told him the wedding was off, that I'd already contacted my deposit vendors to see what could still be recovered, and that whatever conversation needed to happen next would happen through the fraud investigator rather than through me directly. He didn't shout, if anything. That unsettled me more than shouting would have. He simply looked at me for a long moment and said, quietly, that I'd regret handling this the way I was handling it, that things could get complicated for both of us if I insisted on making this official. I recognized the shape of that sentence, too. A soft threat dressed up as a warning. The same species of manipulation my own mother had once used, just wearing different clothes and pointed at a different kind of consequence. He left that night. I did not cry until well after his car had pulled out of the driveway, and even then, it surprised me how much of what I felt wasn't grief exactly, but something closer to the specific exhaustion of realizing you've been fighting the same war twice under 2 different names. Once the apartment was fully quiet, I walked out to the small home office where I kept my father's tool chest, the one piece of him I'd carried from Larkspur Lane into this life, and unlatched it for the first time in months. The notebook was still there, exactly where I'd left it, his handwriting steady enough on some pages and shaking on others, tracking years he clearly hadn't known how to fix in real time. I found the line again, the one I'd read once in a garage full of sawdust and grief. Don't ever sign anything financial you haven't read all the way through yourself. I learned that lesson far too late, reading it again 2 years and 1 engagement later. It no longer felt like a warning I'd already absorbed. It felt like a promise I had quietly broken the moment I was tired enough to want somebody else to carry the weight for me. I understood, sitting there on the floor of my own office with that notebook open in my lap, that my father hadn't written that line only for the family that had already hurt him. He'd written it, whether he knew it consciously or not, for every version of trust that would ever ask me to stop paying attention. And I had let exactly one of those versions through anyway, because it had worn the face of someone who loved me. I closed the chest, but I kept the notebook out on my desk after that, where I would actually see it every single morning. A small, deliberate inconvenience I built into my own routine on purpose. I have never been someone who responds well to vague resolutions. Resolutions dissolve. A physical object sitting in your direct line of sight, on the other hand, has a way of enforcing itself. The bank's fraud department moved faster than I expected, assigning an investigator within the week who walked me through exactly how the equity line had been structured, how the limited power of attorney I'd signed had technically authorized enough scope for Marcus to act, how the whole arrangement sat in a gray zone that was more common than I wanted to believe. She used the phrase authorized user fraud, explaining that it was one of the hardest categories to prosecute cleanly, precisely because the paperwork looks legitimate on its face, and that my own detailed timeline, cross-referenced against Renee's account, was going to matter enormously in establishing intent. I thought hearing that about how much of my adult life had come down to exactly this kind of documentation, receipts, statements, Timestamps. Every man in my life so far had underestimated how thoroughly I record things, and every single time, that underestimation had turned out to be the thing that saved me in the end. Renee called again that same week, this time to check on me rather than to warn me, and I found myself genuinely glad to hear from her. Two women who had never met in person, now bound together by a shared, very specific kind of education. She told me the investigation into her own case had reopened as a result of mine, that my timeline had actually strengthened her original complaint enough that the bank was reconsidering a claim they'd previously closed. Neither of us had planned it that way. It happened anyway, one betrayal accidentally repairing the damage of another. The fraud investigator, a methodical woman named Priscilla who spoke in the same careful, unhurried cadence Odette Kim used, called me 3 weeks into the review with an update she framed as routine, but that landed on me like anything but, reconstructing the paper trail behind the equity line. Her office had pulled every document connected to the original loan file, including the standard employment and reference information Marcus had provided when the account was first opened years earlier, well before he and I had even met. Buried in that older paperwork was a line listing his professional references, and one name on it stopped me cold when Priscilla read it aloud. He'd listed himself as having been introduced to several past financial clients through, in his own words, a wellness and community outreach connection at Henrico Doctors, the hospital where I'd worked my entire career. I asked her, as evenly as I could manage, whether that meant the hospital itself was somehow implicated in what he'd done. She was quick to clarify that nothing suggested institutional wrongdoing, only that Marcus appeared to have built at least part of his client base through informal introductions connected to my own workplace, likely predating our relationship by a year or more. It was a loose thread, she said, not an accusation. The kind of detail that shows up in half the fraud cases her office handles and usually goes nowhere. I thanked her and hung up and sat with that detail longer than its apparent unimportance probably warranted. Something about it nagged at me in a way I couldn't immediately articulate. The specific unease of a lab value that's technically within normal range but still somehow wrong for this particular patient. I thought back, unprompted, to the fundraising gala where I'd first met Marcus, trying to remember exactly who had been standing near us, who might have made an introduction I'd been too distracted to notice at the time. I couldn't place it precisely. Nearly 3 years of memory doesn't organize itself conveniently on command. But a name surfaced anyway, unbidden. Someone who'd stopped by our table briefly that evening, warm and familiar. Someone I'd known and trusted since I was 21 years old, fresh out of nursing school and terrified of my own inexperience. Diane Sorensen had been at that gala. Diane had, in fact, been the one who first waved Marcus over to say hello, mentioning offhandedly that he was a wonderful financial mind she'd met through some hospital wellness committee, someone worth knowing, I told myself, sitting there turning the memory over, that this meant absolutely nothing on its own. Diane knew hundreds of people through 15 years of hospital fundraising circuits. A single friendly introduction at a crowded gala proved nothing beyond ordinary networking, the kind of casual social choreography that happens at every event like that one. I filed the detail away, the same careful, non-committal way I file an unusual finding on a chart that doesn't yet warrant escalation, and went back to focusing on the part of this mess that actually mattered, recovering what I could, and finishing once and for all with Marcus. I had no idea yet how much that one small, dismissed detail was about to matter. That evening, alone in my kitchen, I found myself scrolling back through old photos on my phone almost against my own will, hunting for anything from that gala night. I found exactly one, blurry, taken by someone else, and later shared into a group text of coworkers. Marcus and me standing near the dessert table, Diane visible at the edge of the frame, mid-laugh, her hand resting lightly on Marcus's forearm in the easy, familiar way she touched everyone she liked. I stared at that photograph longer than it deserved, trying to read intention into a gesture that, on any other night, would have meant absolutely nothing at all. Diane Sorensen had been my charge nurse back when I was 21 years old, fresh out of school and thoroughly convinced I'd chosen the entirely wrong profession after my very first truly bad code. She'd sat with me in the break room afterward, said almost nothing useful in the way of advice, and simply stayed until my hands stopped shaking. 15 years later, she'd written the recommendation letter that got me my first management position, had come to my father's funeral without being asked, had sent flowers when Marcus and I got engaged. If I'd been asked, at any point over those 15 years, to name the people in my professional life I trusted without reservation, her name would have been near the very top of a very short list. That was precisely why the detail refused to fully leave my mind, even after I told myself it meant nothing. Not because I suspected her of anything specific, simply because the two people who had hurt me worst in my adult life, up to that point, had both been people I trusted completely, and some quiet, newly cautious part of me had started, almost against its will, keeping a wider net than it used to. I put the phone down, told myself I was being paranoid in the aftermath of a genuinely traumatic few weeks, and went to bed. It would be months before I fully understood how wrong, and how uncomfortably right, that quiet instinct actually turned out to be. And by the time I did, I would wish more than anything that I'd simply trusted it that night instead of talking myself out of it in the dark. Renee and I met in person for the first time on a Saturday morning at a coffee shop halfway between our two lives. A neutral, unremarkable place, with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu, chosen deliberately because neither of us wanted this conversation happening anywhere that felt like it belonged to either one of us. She was smaller than I'd pictured from her voice on the phone. Dark hair pulled back plainly, dressed like someone who'd come straight from grading papers, which, as a high school English teacher, she very likely had. We recognized each other instantly despite having never once met in person before. The particular recognition of two people who've spent weeks quietly rehearsing the same difficult conversation in their own heads. I almost canceled twice, she admitted, settling into the chair across from me. Wrapping both hands around a coffee she didn't seem interested in drinking. It felt strange, meeting the woman who almost married my ex-husband. I wasn't sure what version of this conversation we were supposed to have. I've been rehearsing what to say to you since the first call, I told her honestly. I never landed on anything that felt adequate. What followed wasn't the awkward, competitive conversation either of us had apparently been bracing for. It felt closer to two people comparing notes on the exact same illness, cataloging symptoms neither of us had recognized as symptoms until hearing them named out loud by someone else who'd lived through the identical pattern years before we ever crossed paths. She told me about the early days of her own marriage to Marcus, how endlessly patient he'd seemed back then, how he always appeared to intuit exactly what she needed before she'd even managed to put it into words herself. The very same qualities I had once found so remarkable that I'd built an entire proposal around them without questioning where that talent actually came from. He watches, she said, staring into her coffee. That's the thing nobody warns you about. He's not impulsive. He studies people first, finds the exact moment they're too tired to think clearly, and that's when he asks for what he actually wants. With me, it was my father's hospice care. With you, it sounds like it was flu season. I felt something settle into place hearing her say it out loud, a confirmation I hadn't fully let myself need until that moment. This wasn't a string of unrelated bad decisions on my part. It was a method, tested and refined, deployed against at least two women who happened to share the exact same profession. The exact same instinct to run themselves ragged, caring for other people until there was nothing left over to guard their own interests. We talked for almost 2 hours. Well past the point either of us had originally planned to stay. She told me the bank had reopened her original complaint, thanks entirely to the timeline I'd provided, and that she finally had a real, credible chance of recovering at least part of what she'd lost years earlier. I told her about Odette Kim, about the notary revoking my power of attorney within a single day, about my father's notebook sitting open on my desk now, instead of locked away inside a steel chest where nobody could see it. Near the end, unprompted, she reached across the small table and squeezed my hand once, briefly. "I'm glad you didn't marry him," she said. "I'm sorry it cost you what it cost you to find that out, but I'm glad." I drove home that afternoon feeling something I hadn't expected to feel at all after everything. Not triumph, and not quite relief either. Something closer to companionship. The specific, unlooked-for comfort of discovering that a wound you thought was entirely yours turns out to have a shape someone else recognizes on sight. We exchanged numbers before parting, not out of obligation, but because neither of us wanted the conversation to feel like a single, contained transaction. Renee texted me a photo that same evening, a printed page from her own old case file, the exact loan amount and date circled in pen, with a message underneath. For whatever it's worth, this is the first time in 3 years I've looked at this and felt like it might actually matter to someone besides me. I sat with that message for a long time before responding. It occurred to me, reading it again, that I had spent most of my adult life absorbing other people's pain quietly and alone. My parents' financial mess, Marcus's hidden debt, all of it processed in solitary kitchens at midnight with nobody to confirm I wasn't imagining the shape of what had happened to me. Renee's willingness to hand me her own evidence, unprompted, felt like the first time in this entire ordeal that somebody had handed me something instead of taking it. I wrote back eventually, thanking her, telling her I hoped her case moved quickly now that the bank was actually paying attention. Then I added one more line, something I hadn't planned to say until it was already typed out on the screen in front of me. Whatever happens with the money. I told her, you already did something that mattered more than the money. You warned a stranger, and it worked. She sent back a single word. Good. That single word sat with me the rest of the evening, small and plain and entirely sufficient, the exact opposite of every carefully constructed sentence Marcus had ever handed me across nearly 3 years of practiced, patient conversation. The fraud case moved through its final stages faster than either Odette or Priscilla had led me to expect, helped considerably, they both admitted, by the sheer completeness of the documentation I'd handed over. Between my own timeline, Renee's corroborating account, and the bank's internal review of how the power of attorney had been misapplied, the case against Marcus assembled itself into something clean enough that the bank agreed to reverse a substantial portion of the fraudulent draw. Not all of it, and I want to be honest about that particular detail, because tidy endings tend to make for better stories than they make for accurate ones. And this recovery wasn't entirely tidy in the end. Legal fees and processing costs ate into the recovery, and roughly $9,000 of the original $58,000 simply proved untraceable, likely gone the way gambling debts go, into accounts and hands that left no paper trail worth following. Still, getting back the bulk of it felt less like victory and more like a wound closing cleanly instead of festering, which, after everything, was more than I'd let myself expect. Marcus, for his part, disappeared from Richmond sometime during the final weeks of the investigation. His apartment lease wasn't renewed. Calls to his old number went straight to a full voicemail box that never emptied, Priscilla told me, in the careful, non-committal tone bank employees use when they know more than they're allowed to say, that men in his situation often relocate somewhere the debts and the reputation haven't caught up yet, and that I likely wouldn't hear from him again unless the criminal side of the investigation, still technically open, eventually required it. I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I didn't strictly need him to face anything more dramatic than quiet disappearance in order to feel finished with the whole ordeal. I had spent enough of my life waiting for other people's accountability to arrive on a schedule that suited my own healing, and I had learned, the hard way, that waiting for it rarely worked out. Recovering the money and closing the door myself turned out to be enough. Life, in the weeks after the money was recovered, started resembling something ordinary again in a way I'd nearly forgotten was possible. I picked up an extra shift here and there, not out of financial necessity, but because the rhythm of the unit had always been the one place my mind reliably quieted down. I started sleeping through the night without checking my phone first thing at 3 a.m. to make sure nothing new had appeared in my accounts overnight. I even went on exactly 2 dates that spring, both unremarkable in the specific, comforting way unremarkable dates are supposed to feel after you've survived something genuinely dangerous. Evenings that asked nothing more complicated of me than pleasant conversation and a decent meal. My mother and I kept our Sunday ritual going through all of it, though I never told her the full extent of what had happened with Marcus, only that the engagement had ended and that I didn't want to discuss the reasons. She didn't push, which surprised me a little, and which I've since come to understand as its own small, imperfect kind of growth on her part. We were, both of us, learning slowly how to want less from each other than we once had, and somehow wanting each other more honestly because of it. I was in the middle of organizing the last of the case paperwork into a folder for my own records, that instinct never fully leaving me even after everything was resolved, when an email notification popped up on my laptop screen. It was from the hospital's internal communication system, addressed to me directly. Subject line brief and entirely bureaucratic in tone. A request to meet with the Ethics and Compliance Committee, at my earliest convenience, regarding a matter connected to recent external legal proceedings involving hospital-affiliated personnel. I read it twice, confused more than alarmed at first. I assumed, reasonably enough, that this was simply a formality, the hospital covering its own liability, given that my fraud case had technically referenced an old employment reference tied loosely to the institution. I replied that same afternoon, confirming I'd be available whenever they needed, and went back to my folder of documentation without giving the request much further thought. I want to remember, honestly, exactly how little concern I felt in that moment, because it makes what came next land with the full weight it deserves. I even mentioned the meeting to Jamie in passing, one of the newer nurses on my floor I'd taken under my wing over the past year, and joked that hospital administration had never once in 15 years scheduled anything at my earliest convenience without meaning approximately 3 weeks from now, buried under 6 other priorities. Jamie laughed and told me I worried too much for someone who clearly had nothing to worry about, which felt, at the time, like an entirely reasonable thing for either of us to believe. I walked into that meeting days later fully expecting a routine conversation, the kind hospital administration schedules purely to cover its own paperwork whenever an employee's name surfaces anywhere near a legal proceeding. However, tangentially, I had no reason yet to expect anything else. And if I'm honest, some small, tired part of me was almost looking forward to it. One final formality standing between me and finally, truly, putting the entire Marcus chapter behind me for good. Diane called me herself, 2 days before the scheduled committee meeting, her voice warm and immediately familiar in exactly the way it had always been. The same steady voice that had once talked me through my very worst shift as a brand new nurse, without ever once making me feel small or inadequate for needing that kind of help at all. "I heard through the grapevine that you've had an incredibly hard year," she said, and I remember hearing that, a small rush of gratitude that someone with her seniority had bothered to notice at all. I wanted to call before Thursday, get ahead of things a little, make sure you walk in there feeling supported rather than blindsided. I told her I appreciated it more than she probably realized, and I meant it completely. She suggested we grab coffee together the following afternoon, just the two of us, so she could walk me carefully through how these particular committee meetings typically unfolded and help me think through exactly how best to present everything. It felt, in the moment, like exactly the kind of mentorship she'd offered me a dozen times before over 15 years. The quiet, practical guidance that had shaped nearly every meaningful decision in my career. We met at a small cafe near the hospital campus, and Diane was, if anything, even more attentive than usual that afternoon, asking careful, specific questions about the entire situation with Marcus, the exact timeline, the total amount involved, how the hospital's name had ended up connected to any of it in the first place. I answered everything openly, grateful for what felt like genuine concern, laying out details I hadn't shared with anyone outside the investigation itself, the exact sequence of the gala, the reference on his old loan paperwork, even my own half-formed, quickly dismissed suspicion about the introduction that night. "You did absolutely nothing wrong here," she told me at one point, reaching across the small table to squeeze my hand briefly, the exact same gesture she'd used 2 years earlier, standing beside me at my own father's funeral. "I want you walking into that room Thursday, already knowing that clearly, whatever happens in there, I've got your back completely." I left that conversation feeling steadier than I had in weeks, genuinely comforted. The specific and familiar relief of believing you have an ally with real institutional standing sitting beside you in a room that might otherwise feel intimidating and unfamiliar. What I did not see, because there was no way for me to see it, happened perhaps 20 minutes after I'd driven away from that same cafe parking lot. Diane, still seated at our table, placed a second call, this one to a colleague in hospital administration. Her voice noticeably different from the one she'd used with me all afternoon. Clipped and businesslike in a register I had genuinely never once heard from her in 15 years of working together. "If anyone happens to ask how Whitfield originally connected with hospital staff," she said, her voice low enough that a passing server barely caught even the edge of it. "Let's just keep my own name out of that particular conversation entirely. No reason to go complicating a simple compliance review with old history that ultimately has nothing to do with any of it." She hung up, finished her coffee alone, and left. Entirely unaware that a young nurse 2 tables away, someone who recognized her voice immediately and had simply been too startled to make her presence obvious, had heard every word of it. That nurse was Jamie Ostrander, 26 years old. Barely 18 months out of her own nursing program, someone I had personally mentored through her hardest rotation the previous year, the same way Diane had once mentored me. Jamie had stopped in for coffee before her own shift, seen Diane at a nearby table, and instinctively kept her distance rather than interrupt what looked like a private conversation, never imagining she was about to overhear something that would sit uneasily in her chest for the following several days. I knew none of this yet, of course. I drove home from my own conversation with Diane that same afternoon feeling entirely reassured, replaying her words in my head, whatever happens, I've got your back, and letting myself believe, completely, that Thursday's meeting would be little more than a formality with a friendly, powerful ally already seated firmly in my corner. I had spent 2 years learning to recognize deliberate patience as something worth questioning whenever it showed up in a romantic partner. I had not yet learned to apply that same scrutiny to deliberate kindness arriving from someone I had trusted, without a single reservation, for 15 consecutive years of my professional life. Jamie, meanwhile, spent that entire evening turning the overheard conversation over in her own head, weighing what she owed me against what she risked for herself. She was still new enough in her career to understand, viscerally, how much power someone like Diane held over a young nurse's entire future, which shifts she got assigned, which recommendations followed her to the next job, which small mistakes got quietly overlooked, and which ones became permanent marks on a record. I would learn all of this later, secondhand. Once Jamie finally worked up the nerve to tell me herself, that Thursday morning, I walked into the ethics committee meeting with absolutely no idea any of it had happened at all, still fully convinced I had an ally waiting for me on the other side of that door. Looking back, I've asked myself many times whether I should have caught something in Diane's voice that afternoon at the cafe, some small crack in the performance the way I'd once caught one in Marcus's. I don't think I could have. She was better at this than he was, because she'd had 15 years of my complete trust to build on instead of 3. I walked into that committee meeting believing, completely, that I had an ally waiting in the room. I had already survived my own family closing ranks against me once, and a fiancé's careful, calculated manipulation a second time after that, I told myself, driving to the hospital that Thursday morning with coffee going cold in the cup holder, that whatever waited on the other side of that particular door couldn't possibly be worse than everything I'd already come through and survived. I want you to remember that thought, because I'm about to tell you exactly how wrong it turned out to be, and exactly how far a person you have trusted for a decade and a half will go to protect herself once the wrong question finally lands in the wrong room. The conference room on the administrative floor looked exactly like every other conference room I'd sat in over the past 2 years. A long table, bad coffee, people arranged around it with folders they mostly didn't need to open. I walked in 7 minutes early, spotted Diane already seated near the head of the table, and felt something in my chest unclench slightly at the sight of her familiar face. She didn't quite meet my eyes when I sat down. I noticed it, filed it away as nerves on her part, professional discomfort at having to sit through a colleague's difficult meeting, and turned my attention instead to Dr. Alan Reyes, the committee's chair, a measured internist I'd worked alongside for years without knowing particularly well. He opened by explaining, in the flat, procedural language administrators use for everything, that the committee had convened to review potential institutional exposure connected to a recent external fraud investigation involving a former hospital-affiliated contact. Then he turned the floor over to Diane, and everything I thought I understood about that room fell out from under me at once. She began by saying how much she valued me, how many years we'd worked together, framing every sentence with the careful softness of someone about to deliver terrible news gently. The exact register she'd used at my father's funeral, the exact register I had trusted without question for 15 years. And then, underneath all that softness, she began describing a version of events I barely recognized. She suggested, delicately but unmistakably, that my personal financial entanglement with Marcus reflected a broader pattern of insufficient judgment, that allowing my private life to become entangled with the hospital's name, however unintentionally, raised legitimate questions about risk management on my part, questions the committee would need to weigh carefully when considering my current standing and future responsibilities within the department. Not once did she mention that she herself had introduced Marcus to hospital colleagues years before I ever met him. Not once did she acknowledge the coffee we'd shared 2 days earlier, the hand she'd squeezed across that small table, the promise she'd made me looking me directly in the eyes. Whatever happens, I've got your back. I sat there, genuinely unable to process what I was hearing at first. The specific disorientation of watching someone you trust completely rearrange the facts of your own life in real time, right in front of you, while everyone else in the room simply nods along because they have no reason yet to suspect the narrative is anything other than accurate. Dr. Reyes asked me directly whether I had anything to add. I heard my own voice come out steadier than I felt, laying out the actual timeline again. The power of attorney, the fraud investigation, my own cooperation with the bank throughout the entire process. It sounded, even to my own ears, thin against the weight of what Diane had just implied about my judgment as a professional. Dr. Reyes closed the meeting by explaining, in the same careful, procedural language he'd opened with, that the committee would review everything discussed and reach a formal recommendation within 2 weeks. A recommendation that could range anywhere from no action at all to a formal note in my personnel file, up to and including referral for licensure review depending on how they weighed my judgment against the hospital's exposure. He thanked everyone for their candor. Diane thanked him in return, gathered her folder, and left the room without once glancing my way. I stayed seated a moment longer than everyone else, staring at the same water stain on the ceiling tile I'd noticed the very first time I ever sat in that room years earlier, for an entirely unrelated meeting about scheduling. It is strange, the details memory chooses to anchor itself to. I remember that stain more clearly than I remember walking out to my own car afterward. Near the end of the meeting, my license, my standing, possibly my entire career, had come to rest somewhere in the balance of a story that wasn't true, told by the one person in that room I would have trusted with my own life exactly 1 week earlier. I drove home afterward and sat in my own driveway for a long time before I could make myself go inside, trying to understand how the same instinct that had once protected me from Marcus had somehow never once fired. Not a single time, across 15 years of standing loyally beside Diane Sorensen. I thought about my father's notebook, still open on my desk where I could see it every single morning before work. Don't ever sign anything financial you haven't read all the way through yourself. I had followed that rule to the letter with paperwork ever since, checking every document twice, trusting nothing on its surface alone. Nobody had ever warned me the same rule applied just as urgently to people, that a person's kindness could be every bit as unread and unverified as a contract, right up until the exact moment it cost you everything you'd built. I did not call anyone that night. I sat alone with it instead. The way I'd once sat alone with a green column of transfers and later, with a home equity line I never authorized, cataloging the shape of a third betrayal the same careful way I'd learned to catalog the first 2 weeks, Dr. Reyes had said, before the committee reached its recommendation. I decided, sitting there in the dark, that I would not spend those 2 weeks simply waiting to find out what my future looked like in someone else's hands. I intended to build my own case, the same patient, documented way I had built every other case in my life that had actually mattered. I went home and, without fully deciding to, found myself standing in front of my father's tool chest again, the way I had twice before at points in my life when the ground underneath me had shifted too fast to process standing up. I unlatched it slowly, more out of ritual than necessity this time, since I already knew every page of the notebook inside almost by heart. But something made me look past the pages I'd already memorized, further back than I'd ever bothered to read, into the earliest entries from years before any of this began. Most of it was ordinary. Small sums my father had apparently meant to repay me for one thing or another, groceries, a car repair, nothing dramatic. But 2 pages in, past a torn corner and a coffee ring stain, I found an entry that stopped me completely. A single paragraph, dated nearly a decade before the conference room, before any of what I'd survived since. He'd written about a man from church he'd once considered a close friend, someone who'd borrowed tools and money over several years and never returned either. Someone my father strongly suspected, based on things he'd overheard secondhand, of doing the same thing to at least 2 other families in their small congregation. He'd never said anything. He wrote that he told himself it wasn't his business, that confronting a well-liked man without solid proof would only make him look petty and difficult, that staying quiet was the easier, safer choice. The final line of that entry read simply, "I think about the other families sometimes. I wonder if my silence cost them something I could have prevented. I don't know how to live with not knowing." I sat on the workbench stool for a long time after reading that, the cold of the concrete floor working its way up through my shoes, turning the entry over in my mind against everything that had just happened to me that same afternoon. My father, a man who fixed engines and carburetors and porch railings with his own 2 hands, had apparently never learned how to fix the one kind of problem that required speaking up instead of staying silent, and he had carried the weight of that unfinished repair for years without ever telling a living soul, until a notebook meant for me became the only place he could finally set it down. I understood, sitting there, that I was looking at more than a family heirloom. I was looking at a warning written twice over, once about signatures, and once buried further back, about silence. My father had spent his whole life believing that staying quiet in the face of someone else's wrongdoing was the responsible, careful choice, the choice that protected everyone, including himself. He had died still carrying the specific, unresolved guilt of a silence he'd never found the courage to break. I closed the chest gently and sat with that decision for a long moment before standing up. Whatever came next with Diane, whatever it cost me professionally, I was not going to let a version of my father's regret become my own inheritance too. I had already learned, through Marcus and through my own family, exactly what silence protected, and it was never the person choosing to stay silent. Back inside the house. I sat down at my kitchen table with a legal pad, the same yellow legal pad that had carried me through 2 prior versions of exactly this moment, and I made myself a promise before writing a single word. This time, I would not wait for someone else to hand me the proof. I would build it myself, the same patient, unglamorous way I'd built every other case that had ever actually mattered in my life. One verified fact at a time, no speculation. Nothing I couldn't defend under direct questioning if it ever came to that. I thought about calling Odette Kim for advice on how the bank had approached documenting my case with Marcus, then decided against it. This was a different kind of proof I needed now. Not financial records, but a professional history. The shape of a relationship stretching back 15 years. And there was only one place that history actually lived. My own memory. And whatever paper trail 15 years of working alongside someone in the same institution happens to leave behind. Emails, shift schedules, old recommendation letters. The ordinary residue of a long professional friendship that I now needed to examine with a stranger's suspicious eyes instead of a colleague's familiar trust. I opened my laptop that same night and started where every investigation I'd ever conducted had started. At the beginning, with the earliest thing I could actually verify. Rather than the version of events I'd been handed across a cafe table 2 days earlier by someone I had trusted my entire adult career to. It was nearly midnight by the time I finally closed the laptop again, eyes burning, having found nothing conclusive yet. Only a loose folder of old hospital newsletters and fundraiser photo galleries I intended to comb through properly once I wasn't running on pure adrenaline, and 2 hours of actual sleep from the night before. But I had a plan now. Something concrete to hold on to, instead of simply waiting to learn my fate secondhand from a committee decision 2 weeks out. My father had spent years wondering whether his own silence had cost strangers something he could have prevented. I intended to spend the coming 2 weeks finding out, definitively, whether mine would cost me anything at all. I spent the next several evenings working steadily through old hospital newsletters and fundraiser photo galleries the exact way I'd once worked through 6 long years of bank statements, methodically, refusing to let myself skip ahead to comfortable conclusions before the evidence actually supported reaching them. The hospital's internal newsletter archive went back further than I expected. Nearly a decade of low-resolution photos and brief write-ups from galas, blood drives, holiday parties, most of it entirely irrelevant to what I was looking for. I nearly gave up twice, telling myself I was chasing a feeling rather than a fact, the exact kind of reasoning I'd once warned myself against during difficult family assessments at work. Trust the pattern, not the wish for one. I found it on a Wednesday night, in an archived newsletter from roughly 3 years before Marcus and I ever met, a short feature on a hospital-sponsored financial literacy initiative for staff. The kind of low-key wellness programming institutions run, and mostly forget about within a year. Diane was quoted in it, praising the program's guest speaker for the evening, someone she described as a longtime friend and a gifted financial mind, someone worth getting to know personally rather than just professionally. The guest speaker's name was Marcus Whitfield. I read that short paragraph 4 separate times before I let myself fully absorb everything it actually meant, sitting alone at my kitchen table well past midnight. Diane hadn't simply made a casual introduction at a crowded gala the way I'd assumed. She had actively brought Marcus into the hospital's orbit years earlier, vouched for him publicly, in print, describing him in terms clearly intended to build trust among an audience of exactly the kind of overworked, financially exhausted hospital employees who'd make ideal targets for exactly what he eventually did to me. I sat back from my laptop and let myself feel, for the first time since that committee meeting, something closer to anger than confusion. Anger is a genuinely clarifying emotion. In my professional experience, once you let it arrive fully on its own schedule instead of rushing to chase it away too quickly out of politeness, it organizes information differently than fear does. Fear mostly asks what might happen to you next. Anger asks what actually already happened, and precisely who bears responsibility for causing it. I saved the newsletter page, screenshotted it 3 separate ways to make sure the date and byline were unmistakably preserved against any future dispute, and added it to a folder I'd already started calling, in my own head, the same single word I'd used 2 years earlier for an entirely different collection of evidence entirely. Receipts. It seemed, by that point, less like a coincidence and more like the one word my whole adult life kept circling back to whenever somebody I trusted eventually needed to be proven wrong. One old newsletter article wasn't nearly enough on its own to prove Diane had deliberately orchestrated anything against me specifically, and I understood that clearly, drawing on the same careful, unglamorous understanding I'd needed both of the previous times life had asked this exact same thing of me. It proved a connection existed, publicly, on the record. Years before she'd stood in a conference room implying my judgment alone was the only relevant factor worth the committee's attention. It was a solid start. It was not yet anyway, quite enough on its own. I would need one more piece before this became something I could actually bring back into that room. I had no way yet of knowing that the piece I needed was already sitting, unspoken. In the conscience of a 26-year-old nurse, I had trained myself, working up the courage to hand it to me. In the meantime, I kept digging, widening my search past the hospital's own archives into whatever public record existed of Diane's outside professional life. Volunteer board memberships, a handful of local news mentions from various charity events over the years. Nothing that read as remarkable on its own. But patterns rarely announce themselves as remarkable in a single data point. They accumulate. In 3 separate photos spanning roughly 5 years, Marcus appeared somewhere in the frame at events where Diane was also listed as an organizer or honored guest, always peripheral, never quite the subject of the photo. Exactly the kind of presence a person cultivates when they want proximity to influence, without ever drawing enough attention to be asked direct questions about it. I printed everything I found, 3 sets, one for my own records, one for the folder I intended to eventually hand the committee if it came to that, and one I kept separately. In an envelope I didn't examine too closely for what it implied about how little I trusted the process to protect me without a backup plan of my own. I had learned that lesson from my own family first, that institutions and systems, however well-intentioned, rarely move as fast or as fairly as the person standing to lose everything needs them to. I thought, working late into that Wednesday night, about how strange it was that all 3 men and women who had hurt me worst as an adult had each, in their own distinct way, understood something true about institutions and trust that I had been too optimistic to fully account for. That a good enough story, told with enough confidence by someone with enough standing, will almost always be believed over an inconvenient, complicated truth. Right up until somebody produces a document that makes believing the story impossible. Jamie had been carrying it for 4 full days by the time I actually saw her again out on the floor, though I had absolutely no idea yet that she was carrying anything at all, let alone something that would eventually matter this much to both of us. She'd been in the break room getting coffee before her own shift that same afternoon I met Diane at that cafe, close enough to overhear entirely without meaning to, close enough to recognize immediately, without a shred of doubt, exactly whose voice belonged to that clipped, business-like phone call about keeping certain names carefully out of certain conversations. Jamie told me later that her first instinct had been to simply walk away and forget she'd heard anything at all. The sensible, self-protective instinct of someone still new enough in her career to understand exactly how much power a senior nurse manager holds over every part of a young nurse's future. For 4 straight days, she said absolutely nothing to anyone, going through each of her shifts on something close to autopilot, replaying the same 11 or 12 seconds of overheard conversation on a mental loop. She genuinely couldn't seem to switch off no matter how hard she tried. She told me, once she finally worked up the courage to tell me anything, that what kept surfacing wasn't fear exactly. Or not only fear, it was something I had apparently said to her myself, nearly a year earlier, during her hardest rotation. A piece of advice she hadn't expected to matter this much this soon. I had told her, back then, about the importance of accurate charting even when accuracy was inconvenient. Even when the truth of a shift made a colleague or a department look bad. Document what actually happened, I'd said, not what's comfortable to write down. The chart isn't for you. It's for whoever has to make a decision based on it later. And that person deserves the truth, whatever it costs you to write it. Jamie told me she'd thought about that particular piece of advice constantly across those 4 difficult days, turning it over and over the way you turn over instructions you're genuinely unsure still applied outside the narrow, original situation they'd first been given for. She said she kept asking herself whether staying silent about what she'd overheard was really so different from falsifying a chart, whether protecting herself by omission was any more defensible than protecting a colleague by omission would have been. She didn't come to me right away, even after deciding privately that she probably should. She told me later she spent an entire weekend drafting and deleting a text message to me at least a dozen times, terrified of what speaking up might cost her, professionally and personally, in a hospital hierarchy where Diane still held considerable influence over her own future, regardless of whatever committee decision came down about mine. What finally moved her, she told me, wasn't courage exactly. It was running into me in the supply closet on a Tuesday afternoon, both of us reaching for the same box of gloves, and watching my face for just a second before I managed to arrange it into something neutral, tired in a specific way she recognized because she'd worn that same exhausted, cornered expression herself once during her hardest year of training, right before I'd sat with her the way Diane had once sat with me. She didn't say anything that day either, but she told me later that seeing my face in that supply closet was the moment the decision finally stopped being theoretical and started being something she owed to a specific, actual person standing 3 feet away from her, holding a box of gloves. I want to describe what I actually knew during those 4 days, because from where I stood, none of this was visible at all. I noticed Jamie seemed quieter than usual on the floor that week, a little slower to make eye contact. But I chalked it up to the ordinary exhaustion of a demanding rotation and didn't press. I had my own version of that same silence running in parallel, after all, building my folder of screenshots and old newsletters alone at my kitchen table each night, telling almost no one what I was actually doing in case it came to nothing. It didn't occur to me, not once, that somewhere on the same floor, walking the same halls, someone else was quietly wrestling with a piece of the exact puzzle I was trying to assemble by myself. That is, I think, one of the strange cruelties of institutional silence. It isolates people who could otherwise be helping each other, each of us assuming we're the only one who noticed something wrong. Each of us calculating the cost of speaking up in complete isolation from anyone who might actually share the burden if we only knew to ask. By the following Monday morning, Jamie had finally made her decision for good, though at that point I still had absolutely no idea it existed anywhere outside her own head. She told me afterward that she'd written out exactly what she remembered hearing, word for word as best she could reconstruct it, sitting alone in her car in the hospital parking garage before her shift, treating her own memory the same careful way she'd been trained to treat a patient's chart. Accurate, in her own careful handwriting, documented, dated, timed, ready, whenever the moment finally came, to be handed over to whoever actually needed to make a decision based on it. Diane called me again on the Tuesday before the committee's final decision was officially due, and this time her voice had shifted into something I genuinely hadn't heard from her before across 15 full years of knowing her. A register that still wore the outer shape of warmth, but had quietly lost whatever it was that had once made that warmth feel entirely safe to lean on. "I've been thinking about your situation constantly," she said, and I noticed, this time, how carefully she'd chosen the word situation rather than anything that acknowledged her own role in creating it. "I want to help you land somewhere good out of this. Teresa, I really do. But I need you to understand how these things tend to go if they escalate further than they need to," she suggested, in language soft enough that I could immediately tell she'd rehearsed it carefully beforehand, that if I were willing to accept a formal note in my personnel file, acknowledging some vague lapse in personal judgment, something minor and easily explained away in any future reference check, the whole matter could most likely be resolved quietly within the week, with minimal disruption to either of our careers. If, on the other hand, I chose to push back, to formally contest the committee's framing, there was no telling how thoroughly they might decide to examine every aspect of my professional conduct going forward, an outcome she clearly implied would serve neither of us well. I sat with that for a moment before answering, recognizing the shape of it instantly, even though I'd never heard this particular version from her before. It was the same architecture Marcus had used, dressed in an entirely different vocabulary: comply quietly, and this stays small, push back, and you risk losing far more than you're currently being asked to give up. Fear, wearing whatever costume the moment required, aimed now not at my heart or my finances, but at the one thing I had left that Marcus had never managed to touch: my professional standing, the identity I had built for myself independent of every family and every relationship that had ever failed me. "I appreciate you calling me directly about this," I told her, keeping my own voice carefully level, the same flat, controlled register I'd once used in that quiet diner with my father, in that conference room with my mother, in my own kitchen with Marcus months earlier. I'll think seriously about everything you've just said to me. I hung up and sat with the full shape of what had just happened for a long time afterward. This was the clearest version yet of exactly what was happening to me, articulated by the person doing it, in real time. And somehow that clarity felt almost like a relief after weeks of uncertainty. I no longer had to wonder whether I was imagining a pattern. Diane had just confirmed it herself. Carefully, deliberately, in language designed to sound like concern rather than what it actually was. I thought about the 2 prior versions of myself who had faced exactly this shape of pressure before. The daughter in that conference room being told nothing changes, sweetheart, and the fiancé being told she was simply too guarded to trust anyone fully. Both times, the pressure had worked for a while, because I hadn't yet learned to recognize its architecture quickly enough to resist it in the moment it was actually happening. This time, I recognized it instantly. And recognizing it, I found, made it considerably easier to refuse. I called Odette Kim that same evening, not because there was anything financial left for her to actually help with at this point, but because talking through the shape of a fresh threat with someone who'd already helped me survive one earlier version of it seemed, in the moment, like the single sanest option available to me. She listened patiently to the entire story without interrupting me even once, then said something I have genuinely held on to ever since that conversation. People who threaten quietly, she told me, almost always do it because the loud version wouldn't survive daylight. Make her say it in daylight. I turned that phrase over for the rest of the night. Diane had spent our entire relationship communicating in private. Careful conversations, cafe tables, and phone calls. Exactly the kind of setting where a soft threat can be delivered and, if necessary, later denied or reframed as concern. Every version of pressure I'd survived so far, from my mother, from Marcus, had relied on exactly that same architecture of privacy. Nothing said where it could be verified. Nothing that couldn't later be recast as misunderstanding. I decided, sitting with that thought, that whatever happened next needed to happen somewhere Diane couldn't quietly reshape the story afterward. I didn't yet know how that would happen, or that the answer was already forming itself independently in the mind of a 26-year-old nurse 3 floors away from my own office. I only knew that daylight, in Odette's word for it, was exactly what this situation had been missing from the very beginning. I did not call Diane back that week. I let my silence answer for me instead. The very same silence I'd once used against my own mother years earlier, deployed now with far more deliberate precision than I'd had access to back then, because precision, I had finally and fully learned by this point, was the only language every single one of them had ever actually respected. From the very first betrayal to this one, Jamie found me at the end of my shift on a Thursday, catching me in the parking garage stairwell where we were unlikely to run into anyone else. Her folded piece of notebook paper visibly gripped in one hand the entire time she waited for me to notice her standing there. "Do you have a minute?" she said, and something in her voice made me stop walking immediately. We sat on the concrete steps of that stairwell, an unglamorous place for a conversation that would end up mattering as much as it did. And Jamie told me everything, haltingly at first, and then in a rush once the first few sentences were finally out. The cafe, the overheard call, the 4 days of not knowing what to do with it. She apologized twice for not coming to me sooner, and both times I told her she had nothing to apologize for. Meaning it completely. She handed me the folded paper, her own handwritten account, dated the same day she'd overheard it. Every detail she could remember recorded as precisely as she could manage. I read it twice, standing there in that stairwell, and felt something settle into place that had been circling, unconfirmed, for weeks. It wasn't just corroboration of my own suspicions. It was proof of exactly the intent Diane had been so careful never to leave a trace of anywhere I could see it. "I don't know what you're going to do with this," Jamie said, watching my face carefully. "I just couldn't keep sitting on it anymore. You taught me that. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment. Because it wasn't simple triumph. Even though I finally had the second piece of evidence I'd been searching for since that first committee meeting. What I felt most, standing there, was something closer to grief for Jamie. A 26-year-old nurse who had just risked a piece of her own career, however small, to hand a colleague the truth simply because it was the right thing to do. I understood, better than most people could, exactly what that kind of courage costs a person, and exactly how rarely it gets rewarded the way it deserves to be. "You don't have to testify to anything if you don't want to," I told her. "This is already more than I had an hour ago. Whatever you decide from here is entirely your call, and I mean that." Jamie was quiet for a long moment, staring at the stairwell's fluorescent lights reflected on the concrete floor. Then she said something that told me, more than anything else she could have said, exactly why I had wanted to mentor her in the first place. "I already decided," she said. "I'm going to tell the committee myself, in person, whatever happens after that. I just needed you to know first, before anyone else did." I hugged her, briefly, awkwardly, the way two people who mostly communicate through professional distance hug when the moment finally calls for something else entirely. Then we both went back to our separate cars in that same parking garage, carrying, for the first time in this whole ordeal, a piece of the fight that neither of us had to carry entirely alone anymore. Driving home that evening, I found myself thinking, unexpectedly, about my father's notebook again. About the entry describing a friend he'd suspected of wronging other families and had never once found the courage to confront directly. I thought about how differently that entry might have read if even one other person, just one, had come forward at the time to share the burden of speaking up, the way Jamie had just shared mine. Courage, I was beginning to understand, rarely operates entirely alone. It tends to need a witness, someone else in the room who has already decided the truth is worth the risk, before a second person can find the nerve to follow. I called Priscilla the next morning, the same fraud investigator who'd handled my case with Marcus, not because Jamie's account fell under her jurisdiction, but because I wanted professional guidance on how to formally submit new evidence to an internal hospital committee without it looking like retaliation against Diane. However justified retaliation might have actually felt in that moment. Priscilla walked me through the process patiently, told me exactly which forms Dr. Reyes's office would need, and reminded me, gently, that documentation delivered calmly always outperforms documentation delivered in anger, a lesson I had, by that point in my life, learned more thoroughly than I ever wanted to. That weekend, I drafted a formal written statement to accompany both the newsletter evidence and Jamie's account, reading it over a dozen separate times before I finally judged it ready, stripped down to nothing except verified, defensible fact. Exactly the disciplined way I'd learned to build every single case that had ever actually mattered in my adult life. Starting with a green column of transfers I'd once been too frightened to add up at all. I emailed the completed statement to Dr. Reyes's office late Sunday night, along with copies of the newsletter page and, with her explicit permission, Jamie's own written account, requesting a second, formal hearing before any final recommendation was issued regarding my standing. I did not send a copy to Diane. I had learned, by that point, exactly what happened to evidence handed quietly to someone with every incentive to reshape it, before it reached anyone with real authority to weigh it fairly. Monday morning, An automated confirmation arrived acknowledging receipt of my request, along with a notice that a second hearing had been scheduled for later that same week. I read the email standing in my own kitchen, coffee in hand, and felt, for the first time since that first devastating committee meeting, something that finally resembled solid ground beneath my feet again. The second hearing convened in the exact same conference room, the same long table, the same tired water stain on the ceiling tile I'd found myself fixating on weeks earlier during the first meeting, though absolutely nothing else about that room felt remotely the same, walking into it this second time around. Dr. Reyes opened by acknowledging the new evidence submitted, formal and neutral in his phrasing, and invited me to present it directly rather than simply summarize it secondhand the way the first meeting had allowed Diane's version of events to stand unchallenged. I laid out the newsletter article first, the date, the quote, Diane's own words praising Marcus years before I ever met him, passing printed copies around the table so nobody had to take my description of it on faith alone. I watched Diane's face while the pages circulated. She kept her expression carefully composed, the same professional stillness I imagined she'd used in 100 difficult meetings over her career. But something had shifted underneath it, a tightness around her eyes that hadn't been there in the first meeting, when she'd still believed her version of events was the only one anyone would ever hear. Doctor, Reyes asked her directly. Once everyone had finished reading, whether she'd been aware of any prior connection to Marcus Whitfield before my own engagement to him, she answered smoothly, almost too smoothly, that the hospital hosted dozens of community speakers and outreach partners over the years, that she genuinely couldn't be expected to recall every casual professional acquaintance from nearly a decade of institutional programming, and that whatever coincidental overlap the newsletter documented had no bearing whatsoever on her assessment of my own judgment in this matter. It was, I'll admit, a reasonably good answer, delivered with real conviction. It might genuinely have held up on its own, against nothing more than a single old newsletter article with no other corroborating evidence weighing against it in that room. That was the moment Jamie asked to speak. I hadn't known, walking into that room that morning, that Jamie intended to be physically present at all, let alone that she would ask to take the floor herself rather than simply submit her written account privately and stay entirely out of the room itself. She stood, visibly nervous, her hands not quite steady, and asked Dr. Reyes for permission to share something she'd personally overheard. She told the room exactly what she'd already told me privately in that stairwell days earlier. The cafe, the overheard phone call, the specific instruction to keep certain names carefully out of certain conversations going forward. Her voice shook noticeably through the first few sentences and gradually steadied as she continued speaking. The way voices tend to do once the hardest part of a difficult truth is already out in the open and there's genuinely nothing left to do but finish saying the rest of it. The room went genuinely silent once she finished. I watched Diane's composure finally crack, not into confession exactly, but into something considerably less smooth than the answer she'd given only minutes earlier. She started to object, said something about context and misunderstanding, and the more she talked, the more her own defense began to resemble the precise pattern Jamie had just described. Someone working hard, in real time, to manage a story rather than simply tell the truth of it. Dr. Reyes let her finish, thanked Jamie for her courage in coming forward, and told the room the committee would need to reconvene privately before reaching any further recommendation. But I could see it already, in the faces around that table, in the particular kind of silence that follows the moment collective belief actually shifts. Something in that room had irreversibly changed, and everyone present understood it at exactly the same time. I want to describe what it felt like sitting in that specific silence, because it wasn't the vindication I might have expected after weeks of building toward exactly this moment. It felt closer to the stillness, right after a difficult code finally stabilizes. When the crisis is technically over, but nobody in the room has quite caught up to that fact yet. Bodies still braced for something that has already stopped happening. I looked over at Jamie, still standing, still visibly shaking slightly, and gave her the smallest nod I could manage, trying to communicate everything I didn't have words for in that particular moment. You did the right thing. I know exactly what that cost you. Thank you. Diane didn't look at either of us. She stared instead at a point somewhere on the table in front of her, her earlier composure fully gone now, replaced by something that looked, for the first time in 15 years of knowing her, genuinely uncertain. I felt, watching her, an unexpected flicker of something that wasn't quite pity but lived somewhere in its neighborhood. The recognition that a person capable of real kindness for 15 years had also, apparently, been capable of exactly this, and that both of those things had evidently lived inside the same person the entire time without me ever once being able to tell them apart. A junior member of the committee, a nurse manager from cardiology I barely knew personally, quietly gathered the printed newsletter pages back into a neat stack, the small, ordinary gesture of someone needing something practical to do with her hands, while the whole room slowly recalibrated itself around a truth. Nobody in that room had actually been fully prepared to hear that particular morning, myself included. Before the committee moved to close the session and deliberate privately, Dr. Reyes asked if either of us wanted to add anything further to the record. Diane shook her head, quiet now in a way that felt less like composure and more like someone who had simply run out of smooth things to say. I asked for a minute. I stood because it felt important to say what I needed to say from the same height as everyone else in that room, rather than from the seated position of someone asking for permission. I thought, standing there, about every version of this exact moment I had already lived through, twice, in 2 different rooms, with 2 different people who had once claimed to love me. 2 years ago, I said. My aunt told me that family isn't a ledger. She said it while defending a system that had spent my entire adult life treating me exactly like one, adding up what I owed and never once entering anything on the other side of the page. She was right, actually. Family isn't supposed to be a ledger. That's precisely why what she and my mother did was so wrong. They made it one anyway. I looked at Diane directly for the first time since the meeting began. Our profession isn't supposed to be a ledger either. Diane, 15 years of trust doesn't get to function as collateral, something you can draw against whenever protecting yourself gets inconvenient enough to require it. You brought Marcus into our world years before I ever met him. You vouched for him publicly, in print, to an audience of exactly the kind of exhausted, trusting people who make ideal targets for a man like that. And when it finally caught up with both of us, you didn't tell the truth. You calculated exactly how much of it you could afford to let surface. And you decided the answer was none. As long as it meant someone else absorbed the cost, instead of you. The room had gone completely silent. I could hear, faintly, the hum of the building's ventilation system, the only sound filling the space where nobody else was speaking. I spent 6 years being my parents' ledger, I continued. I spent most of a year being Marcus's. I am not going to spend whatever is left of my career being yours. I came into this room the first time trusting you completely, because you'd earned that trust honestly, for a very long time, before you decided it was more useful to you as a tool than as a relationship. I'm not asking this committee to punish you for that. I'm asking this committee to simply stop treating my judgment as the only judgment in this room that needs examining. I sat back down. Nobody spoke for a long moment afterward. Not Dr. Reyes, not the other committee members, not Diane. Jamie, sitting 2 seats down from me, reached over and squeezed my hand once, briefly, the exact gesture Diane had used on me weeks earlier at that cafe table. Except this time it meant precisely what it looked like. It meant, Dr. Reyes finally broke the silence, thanking both Jamie and me for our candor, and adjourned the session for private deliberation. I walked out of that conference room for the second time in a month, and this time, whatever the committee ultimately decided, I already knew I had said the one thing I needed to say out loud, in daylight, in a room full of witnesses, exactly the way Odette had told me to. In the hallway afterward, waiting for the elevator with Jamie standing quietly beside me, I found myself thinking about the exact phrase I'd used in that room. Family isn't a ledger, and how strange it felt to hear my own voice repurpose something my Aunt Sharon had once wielded against me as a weapon of guilt. She'd meant it, back in that other conference room 2 years earlier, as an accusation, implying I was the one keeping score, the one reducing love to arithmetic. I had carried the sting of that accusation for a long time without ever fully examining whether it was true. Standing in that hospital hallway, I understood, finally and completely, that Sharon had gotten the diagnosis right and the patient wrong. Nobody in my life had ever reduced love to a ledger except the people asking me to keep funding it, without ever making a single entry in return. I hadn't invented the ledger. I had simply been the only one honest enough to eventually read it out loud. Jamie broke the silence first, her voice still a little unsteady from everything that had just happened in that room. "That was the bravest thing I've ever watched anyone do," she said. "You went first," I told her, meaning it completely. "I just borrowed the courage you handed me an hour ago and used it." The elevator arrived, and neither of us said much on the ride down, both of us still visibly running on the particular adrenaline that follows a confrontation you weren't sure you'd survive intact, outside, in the parking garage. Jamie hugged me again, longer this time than the first hurried embrace in the stairwell days earlier, and told me she'd see me on the floor the following week, whatever the committee ultimately decided about either of us. I drove home slowly that evening, taking the long way through parts of the city I didn't strictly need to pass through, unwilling yet to simply arrive somewhere and sit still with everything that had just happened. Somewhere around the halfway point of that unnecessary detour, I understood that regardless of what the committee's formal decision turned out to be, something more important had already been settled inside me in that conference room. I was done being anyone's ledger, and I had finally said so out loud, to the exact person it needed saying to, in the exact room where it would count. The committee's formal decision arrived by email 4 days later, longer than the 2 weeks originally promised for the first review, which Dr. Reyes explained to me personally in a brief follow-up phone call, reflected exactly how seriously the committee had ultimately taken the additional evidence once it fully surfaced. My own record was cleared entirely, the language in the letter unambiguous in a way institutional language rarely bothers to be. No finding of impaired judgment, no note in my personnel file. The committee's letter went further than I'd expected, explicitly acknowledging that the original framing of my situation had relied on incomplete information, a careful, bureaucratic way of admitting that Diane's version of events had been substantially misleading without using language that might expose the hospital to liability for having believed it in the first place. Diane's own outcome, relayed to me secondhand through informal channels I wasn't officially any part of, turned out to be considerably less gentle than mine. She was removed from her management position effective immediately, reassigned to a clinical role without supervisory authority pending a broader internal review of her conduct, one that would eventually examine, according to hospital gossip that reached me within days. Several other decisions she'd made over the years that colleagues had apparently been too intimidated to question at the time. I want to describe honestly what it felt like receiving that news, because I don't think it will surprise you to hear it wasn't triumph. Not really. Word moved through the hospital fast, the way it always does in a building full of people who spend entire shifts standing close enough to overhear each other's phone calls. I caught fragments of it in the break room, in the elevator, sympathetic glances from people who'd apparently already picked a side before I'd said a single word to them about any of it. Nobody celebrated, exactly. What I noticed instead was a kind of collective, quiet exhale among people I'd worked alongside for years. The relief of colleagues who had apparently sensed something uncomfortable about Diane's management style for a long time, without ever having language or evidence solid enough to act on it. I sat with all of it for several days before deciding what I actually wanted to do next. The obvious path, staying exactly where I was, vindicated and technically entitled to continue building my career in the same department, held a certain appeal. A version of justice that let me keep everything I'd already built while watching Diane's own consequences play out around me. I found, turning the decision over, that I didn't actually want that. Staying meant walking those same hallways every day, carrying the specific knowledge of exactly how thoroughly someone I'd trusted for 15 years had been willing to sacrifice me to protect herself, regardless of whatever formal consequences she eventually faced for it. Vindication. I'd learned once already with Marcus, doesn't automatically restore a place the way it restores a reputation. I submitted my transfer request to a smaller hospital across the city within the month, not running from anything, I told myself carefully, but choosing, deliberately, to build whatever came next somewhere the last 3 years hadn't happened to me first. Jamie took the news of my transfer harder than I expected, finding me in the break room the day I mentioned it, asking, half joking and half not, who exactly was supposed to keep her honest once I was gone. I told her the truth, that she didn't need me for that particular job anymore, that she'd already proven, in a conference room in front of an entire ethics committee, that she knew precisely how to keep herself honest without anyone standing over her shoulder to remind her. She didn't fully believe me that day. I suspect she does now. I met with Odette Kim one final time before the transfer took effect, not for any financial reason, simply to thank her properly for a piece of advice that had ended up mattering considerably more than either of us probably expected when she first offered it. Make her say it in daylight. I told Odette what had happened in that second hearing, and she smiled in the particular way of someone who has spent a career watching people finally learn to protect themselves and never quite gets tired of witnessing it happen. Renee texted me the same week the decision finally came through, having already heard the broad strokes of it secondhand through a mutual connection at the bank. Sounds like you did it again. Her message read simply, I wrote back that I hadn't done it alone this time, that a 26-year-old nurse and a loan officer with excellent instincts had both done at least as much of the actual work as I had. Renee replied simply, That's usually how it goes. Once people stop being ashamed to ask for help. I thought about that message for a long time afterward, turning it over slowly the way I turn over most things that end up genuinely mattering to me. I had spent most of my adult life believing that real strength meant handling absolutely everything alone, quietly, without ever once asking anyone to carry even a small piece of the weight beside me. 3 betrayals into my 30s. I was finally starting to understand that the version of strength that actually manages to protect a person looks considerably less solitary and considerably less impressive from the outside than the version I had spent so many years carefully practicing on my own. My last day at Henrico Doctors fell on an ordinary Friday, no formal send-off, exactly the way I'd asked for it. though a few people from my unit gathered informally in the break room that afternoon anyway with a sheet cake somebody had picked up on their way in. Jamie found me near the end of my shift. Holding a small wrapped gift she clearly felt awkward presenting in front of anyone else. So I followed her into the supply closet, the same one where she'd first started deciding, without either of us knowing it yet, to tell me the truth about Diane. Inside the wrapping was a plain notebook, spiral bound, nearly identical to the one still sitting on my desk at home. "So you can keep charting," she said, half joking, the same phrase I'd used with her a dozen times over the past year about the importance of writing things down accurately, whatever it cost you to do it. I hugged her properly this time, not the brief, awkward embrace from the parking garage stairwell, and told her the truth, that she'd already become something better than the version of me she thought she was copying. She'd found her nerve at 26. It had taken me most of my 30s to find mine. Before I left the building for the last time, I walked past Diane's old office, now occupied temporarily by an interim manager while the broader review continued. The nameplate outside had already been changed. Her name removed. No trace left of 15 years except whatever lived on in the memories of the people she'd actually worked alongside. I didn't stop. I didn't feel any particular pull to confront her one final time, or to demand an apology I already understood. From 2 prior betrayals, was never actually coming. What I felt instead, walking that familiar hallway for the last time, was something closer to completion than anger. I had spent 3 years learning the exact same lesson delivered by 3 different people who should each, in their own way, have protected me instead of spending me. My family had taught me the lesson coldest and cruelest in a conference room above a dry cleaner. Marcus had taught it most personally, wrapped in something that had genuinely felt like love for a while. Diane had taught it most institutionally, using the language of mentorship and concern right up until the moment concern would have cost her something. I drove home that evening with the windows cracked, the same habit I'd carried since the night everything first started 6 years earlier, letting the cold air clear my head the way it always had. My father's tool chest sat waiting on the mantel exactly where I'd left it that morning, and for the first time in longer than I could clearly remember, I let myself imagine what it might feel like to walk into a room. Any room. Without silently cataloging who in it might eventually ask me to pay for my place at the table. Before pulling into my own driveway, I stopped at the small grocery store on the corner, the one I'd been driving past twice a day for years without ever once going in, and bought a single bouquet of flowers for no occasion at all, simply because I could, simply because nobody was waiting at home who needed to be paid, appeased, or managed before I was allowed to enjoy something small for myself. It felt, standing at that register with my card in hand, like the most ordinary purchase in the world, and also, somehow, like the most radical one I had made in years. I texted my mother that night, something I did most Fridays by then, a small habit we'd built carefully over the past 2 years without either of us naming it as anything more significant than routine. Last day at the old hospital. I wrote, "Starting somewhere new, Monday." She wrote back within minutes, no mention of money, no mention of anything she needed from me. Just 3 words, "Proud of you." I sat with that message longer than its length probably warranted, the specific weight of an ordinary sentence finally arriving without a hidden invoice attached to it. I thought, setting the phone down on the kitchen counter, about how far that single text message had actually traveled to finally reach me through 6 years of unpaid debt, through a lawyer's office, through a funeral, through an engagement that never technically became a marriage, through a hospital conference room where I'd finally said out loud, to the right person, in daylight, exactly what I had spent nearly 40 years quietly learning how to say, "Proud of you." 3 plain words, no ledger hidden underneath them, no bill quietly arriving the following week disguised as affection. It wasn't everything I might have once wanted from her, but it was, finally, something completely honest. And after everything, honest was the only currency I still wanted from anyone. I called Renee that same night, mostly just to talk. The way two people do once a shared ordeal has settled into something closer to an actual friendship than a coincidence of circumstance. She asked how the last day had gone, and I told her about Jamie's notebook, about the empty nameplate outside Diane's old office, about the flowers I'd bought for no reason at all. "You're doing the thing again," she said, laughing softly. "Building yourself a whole new ledger, except this one only tracks what's actually good, and I hadn't thought of it that way before." But sitting there with my own bouquet on the counter and my father's tool chest, catching the last of the evening light on the mantel, I decided she was probably right. A year passed since I walked out of that second hearing, and I want to tell you honestly, in some detail, how things actually looked by the end of it, rather than how a tidier, more satisfying version of this story might have preferred to end for the sake of a clean finish. I had settled into the new hospital by then, a smaller place across the city where nobody's first association with my name was a conference room or a committee decision. The work stayed the same work, vitals and charts and the particular exhausted grace of a well-run night shift. And I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that starting over professionally in my late 30s felt less like defeat and more like an unexpected kind of freedom. Building a reputation from scratch with nothing attached to it except the actual quality of the work itself. My father's tool chest sat in my home office by then, permanently. No longer something I opened only in crisis. I had finally cleared it out properly that spring, sorted the tools into a proper cabinet, and turned the chest itself into a small display shelf, the notebook resting open on top where I saw it every single morning before work, not as a warning anymore so much as a kind of compass. 3 lessons lived in that notebook by then instead of 1. Read everything before you sign it. Speak up before silence becomes its own kind of guilt. And underneath both of those, in my own handwriting, added, the week after the second hearing, a third line my father never got the chance to write himself. Trust has to be earned continuously, not once, no matter how many years someone has already banked. My mother and I still had coffee most Sundays. Still small, still imperfect. But something had shifted in the texture of it over that year that I hadn't fully expected. She asked about my work by then, actual questions, and listened to the answers instead of steering the conversation back toward herself within a few sentences. She never apologized outright for the trust, for the 6 years, for any of it, and I had stopped waiting for that particular sentence the way you eventually stop waiting for a check you've long since written off as uncollectible. What we had instead was smaller than an apology and, in its own way, more valuable: consistency. She showed up. She asked. She stopped sending bills disguised as affection. I decided that was enough. Not because it erased what came before, but because insisting on more than someone can actually give you is its own kind of debt, one I was no longer interested in extending credit toward. Renee and I talked most weeks by then, an unlikely friendship built entirely out of 2 women independently discovering the same man's cruelty and choosing, afterward, to turn that shared wound into something useful instead of something isolating. Her case against Marcus finally settled that same year, a smaller recovery than she'd hoped for, but a real one. And she called me the moment the paperwork cleared, both of us laughing harder than the news strictly warranted, the specific laughter of people who have survived something together and are finally allowed to feel light about it. Jamie was thriving on her own by then, promoted that same year to a role with real responsibility, and she still texted me periodically with questions I suspected she mostly already knew the answers to. The way you sometimes reach out to a mentor, less for guidance, and more for the reassurance of hearing someone you trust confirm what you already believe. I told her, every time, some version of the same thing. You already know. You've known since that stairwell. She had stopped needing to hear it nearly as often as she used to, which I took as the clearest evidence that the lesson had finally landed for good. Marcus, as far as anyone had told me, was somewhere in another state, another life, presumably running some version of the same pattern on someone who hadn't yet had reason to check the fine print. I thought about that sometimes. The discomfort of knowing a person like that simply continued, unpunished in any lasting sense. Moving through the world looking for the next person too tired to read carefully. It used to keep me up at night. It didn't anymore. Not because I had forgiven him, but because I had finally accepted that his accounting wasn't mine to settle. I had settled my own. That had to be enough. And most days by then, it genuinely was. If there was a single thing worth passing down from everything I had survived, it was this. The people who are supposed to protect you, by blood, by promise, or by title, don't earn that protection automatically just by claiming the role. They earn it the same way anyone earns anything real, through consistent demonstrated action, over and over, in the moments that actually cost them something. Watch for the difference between someone who loves you and someone who has simply learned the correct vocabulary of love well enough to use it against you when it counts. The two can sound identical for a very long time. Only one of them holds up once you finally, carefully, read the fine print. My father had spent his whole life quietly believing love and silence were essentially the same offering. Two sides of one gesture. I understood, by then, that he had been wrong about that, and that his notebook, however painful it had been for me to eventually inherit, had taught me the one thing he never quite managed to teach himself in time to use it. Speaking the truth, clearly and in daylight, costs something real every single time you do it. Staying silent costs considerably more in the end. It simply takes longer for that particular bill to finally come due. And by the time it does, the interest has usually compounded past anything you originally expected to owe. Most evenings that year, I sat in my own office with a cup of tea, my father's tool chest catching the last of the light on its shelf. And I let myself simply be still, without cataloging who in the room might eventually ask me to pay for my place in it. Some nights I still thought about all three of them, my mother's warm hands, Marcus's patient voice, Diane's 15 years of genuine kindness sitting right alongside her, 15 minutes of genuine betrayal. That was the truth, too. The uncomfortable part, most stories like this one skip over. People capable of real harm are very often also capable of real love, sometimes toward the very same person, sometimes in the very same year. I had stopped needing them to be simple villains in order to protect myself from them. I had just needed to finally learn how to read the whole ledger, not only the entries written in someone else's careful, reassuring handwriting,